Adobe After Effects is an application used by video professionals to create engaging motion graphics and cinematic visual effects. Video pros use After Effects for 2D and 3D animation purposes, creating dynamic text animation using robust typography tools, applying non-destructive effects to video using various tinting and adjustment methods, isolating objects from their background using rotoscoping technology, and correcting for camera shake by utilizing cutting-edge stabilization features. After Effects is an industry standard for motion graphics and effects, and it allows you to create visual compositions like these. In addition to its ability to edit, After Effects also integrates with several other Creative Suite applications like Photoshop for animating 3D layers, Premiere Pro with shared effects and copy and paste support, and Flash Professional for creating engaging web animation sequences. Adobe After Effects provides video professionals with a sophisticated animation and compositing environment with several different effects and tools to help take your video project to the next level.
Hi, I'm Ian Robinson, and I want to welcome you to After Effects CS6 Essential Training. Now, I've been using After Effects over 15 years to create dynamic motion graphics for broadcast. After Effects is the industry standard for motion graphics and visual effects artists. I like to call it my Swiss Army knife for video post-production. In this course, we'll get started by familiarizing ourselves with the 6 foundations of After Effects. First, we'll cover compositions, so you understand how to properly start and build your projects. Then, we'll jump into layers, where we'll explore type, blend modes, and compositing techniques like masking and rotoscoping. After that, it's on to animation, where we'll cover the fundamentals of keyframing and more advanced topics like how to refine your movements with parenting, expressions, and the pick whip. Then we'll explore some effects in order to stylize your projects. And sure enough, we'll follow that up with some time for lights, camera, and action as we jump into 3D. To round out our 6 foundations, we'll learn about how to finish your project with rendering. And for you overachievers out there, we'll definitely keep on going to explore advanced topics like stabilizing shaky camera footage, 3D type, 3D motion tracking, and of course, the new ray tracing renderer. So look, I know that learning After Effects can seem daunting at first, but once you get your feet wet, I think you'll be surprised how quickly you'll be able to create some compelling and hopefully fun motion graphics. So let's get started with After Effects CS6 Essential Training. If you're a premium member of the lynda.com online training library, or if you're watching this tutorial on a DVD-ROM, you have access to the exercise files used throughout this title. Now, once you've copied the exercise files folder to your hard drive, let's open the folder and see how our projects are laid out. You should notice there's a folder for each individual chapter. And within each chapter, I have project files that correspond to the videos of that chapter. Now, not every video has a project file, but the majority of them do, and you'll find them within each chapter folder. It's important to understand that this footage folder at the bottom contains files that the After Effects projects will be referencing. So don't move these files around. Make sure they stay in their corresponding folder. Now, some of these footage files were created in external applications, but that's okay because these are all things that are integrated into the After Effects projects. If you are a monthly member or annual member of lynda.com, you don't have access to the exercise files, but you can follow along from scratch with your own assets. So let's get started. The beauty of After Effects is its versatility. From motion graphics projects to visual effects and compositing, it has many different uses and workflows for many different users. But the other beautiful thing about After Effects is its modular design. Once you learn how each module works, you'll have the tools you'll need to be able to push yourself and learn new techniques and effects outside of your normal day-to-day workflow. Now, in this video, I don't want you to panic because I'm going to cover the interface and where everything lives later as we move throughout this chapter. Right now, I just want to cover what the 6 foundations are. So again, as I start showing you the interface and all those different elements, you kind of already have a basic understanding as to how the application works. So to get started, we want to look at compositions. In the left-hand side of the interface, you'll see this project panel, and that's where compositions live. Notice when I click on the composition, it appears up here in the project panel with a thumbnail, and it tells me the actual dimensions, the length, and the frame rate. So you want to think about compositions as containers for layers. They are where you will be building your actual projects. So when you double-click on a composition in the project panel, it opens up the timing panel down here. This is where your timeline is, and these are where your layers are. Notice as I click on each one of these layers, I'm seeing different elements getting highlighted up here in the composition panel. Now, these layers, if you're familiar with Photoshop, work in a very similar fashion. They have a hierarchy, and you may even recognize the eyeballs here on the left that turn on and off the visibility. So layers are the next thing that we want to actually focus on. They're an integral part of building any project inside of After Effects. They determine where you actually create graphic elements, how they look on the screen, their visibility, their transparency, all kinds of information like that. They also control the timing, exactly when those elements will appear on the screen. So don't worry, we'll definitely be diving into layers a little bit more. But next, we need to move on to effects. Effects are the next area we want to focus on because effects are what you use to kind of stylize your layers. So if I click on layer 2 here, see this little FX button? That's letting me know that I have an effect. And this triangle here on the left, if I open that up, you can see I have effects here. So I want to open up those triangles, and you can see I have a color balance effect and a drop shadow on there. You can turn on and off the visibility of those effects just by clicking on each one of the effects here on the left-hand side. Now we're just scratching the surface, but the next thing we want to check out is 3D. Now, a few years ago, I would have called this more of an optional area to focus on just because it, was relatively new. But honestly, now I can't think of an After Effects project I've worked on in the last couple of years where I haven't used 3D in some capacity. So to look at 3D, let's double click this composition over here, which says 3D spin. In this comp, I've built a project where I actually have a 3D element in the scene and an interesting element where it's actually a flat element, but it's moving around in three-dimensional space. See how it's spinning in 3D space there? The way I'm moving in the timeline, this is called my current time indicator, and I'm just scrubbing through the composition. So you can see, again, to sort of reinforce, we have layers here that have things like cameras and lights because these are 3D elements within my layers, within my composition, which is being shown in my comp window. Now, the final thing we need to focus on, rendering. See, once you build all these projects and you have something that you really like, you need to actually create a file that you can send or upload to the web or put in your videos. In order to do that, that's a process called rendering. So in After Effects, when you're finished with a composition, just make sure that it's kind of selected down here in your timeline, and you can go to Composition and Add to Render Queue. When you do that, this area is the area where you can determine different things like what kind of file am I going to create? A QuickTime file, a Photoshop sequence? You get the general idea. This is where we can set things up so when you're all ready to output your project, you can click Render and go. Now, if you're new to After Effects, I'm sure this was kind of a whirlwind tour. But don't worry, the focus of this video, again, was just to give you an overview of the entire process and get you familiar with the core areas we're going to be covering throughout the rest of this course. Right now, we're just laying the foundation so you have the base knowledge, so as we move forward throughout the course, you'll know exactly where we're going and why we're headed there. Just imagine how cool it would be if you could rearrange the living room in your house based on what you wanted to do at the flip of a switch. If you wanted to play video games on the Wii, the coffee table and the rug would slide out of the room to be replaced with a wide-open, clean hardwood floor. Or for movie night, now the floor is lush wall-to-wall carpeting and surround sound speakers flip out. Now your couch is replaced with stadium seating. I know it sounds a little like the Jetsons, but really, that's what Adobe has given us with the ability to make workspaces inside of After Effects. And as I'm sure many of you know, After Effects has a myriad of uses from motion graphic design to visual effects, and each different job usually requires different panels to be available. The first time you start After Effects, you'll probably see this welcome window. I just want to kind of point some things out here really quick. In the window, you could open up recent projects, or open up a project off your hard drive, or create a new composition. One thing that I recommend that you do when you're starting with After Effects, leave this option at the bottom selected. This way, every time you launch After Effects, not only will you see this welcome screen, but you'll see a tip of the day. Now, since I want to have a blank project, I'm just going to choose Close for right now. And let's look at the interface. Now, if your interface doesn't look like this, what you need to do is go to the upper right-hand corner of your After Effects window, and you'll see this workspace pull-down. Mine is set to standard. If you click on that, what you want to do is make sure that yours is set to standard. And if it is, and it still doesn't match what we're looking at, what you need to do is actually reset that workspace. So at the bottom here where it says Reset Standard, click on that. And what that does, any changes you may have made to that layout, this will just blow that away and load it up as though you had just installed the software. This is really important to pay attention to as you're following the rest of this course, because if you ever notice that these panels are different, you'll want to go up to the upper right-hand corner and make sure that we're actually working in the same workspace. To understand the basic workflow of the interface, we need to learn a little bit about compositions. Now, don't worry, I'm going to have an entire video dedicated to this very shortly. But for right now, to make a composition, you want to start in the upper left corner of the After Effects interface. See, in the project panel, there's this button in the bottom. Looks sort of like a film strip with some shapes on it. If you click on that, that will open your comp settings to create a new composition. Now, like I said, this is pretty detailed, so we'll get to this in the next video. For now, let's go ahead and press Cancel. I want to show you the basic circular workflow that I typically work in After Effects. So to do that, let's go up under File, and I'm going to open Recent Projects and open my 0102 workspace project. Once that project is open, you can see in the project panel in the upper left corner, I have two compositions. I also have folders. See, in the project panel, you can organize anything that you bring into After Effects and put them in subfolders. Whenever you double-click a composition, it will open up the corresponding timeline and comp panel so you can see exactly how the project is built. So just to show you what I'm talking about, let's double-click this logo 3D spin comp. See, when I double-click, notice now in the timeline here, I have a whole new timeline. And this specific project actually has 3D in it. I know that because there's a camera and there are some lights. Also, in the upper right-hand corner of the comp window, I can see that I have a different renderer called the Ray Traced renderer. And don't worry again, if you're not understanding exactly what renderers are, we will get to that. Right now, just sort of focus on exactly how this workflow goes. So you want to start in the upper left, open up your compositions. You can make changes to your layers panel, and you will see those things updated in the comp window. You can click on objects directly in the comp window and reposition them, and it will select those objects in the layers panel or the timeline panel because they are directly related. I'm just going to press Command Z and undo that last move. And there's one last thing I want to show you about the interface. Notice as I click on each one of these panels, I'm getting this bright orange outline. That's letting me know that that panel is active. So sometimes when you go up to these menus at the top of After Effects, you may not get one of the options that you're looking for. And that's because these menus will highlight the things that you can work with based on the specific panel that you have selected. Notice as I click around, I'm getting slightly different options based on what I have selected in the different menus. Lastly, with workspaces, most of the time you'll see me working in the standard workspace, but sometimes if you're doing specific workflows, you want to actually adjust how the panels are set up. So I might switch to the text setting to set a bunch of text in my project. So let's click on that and see what that looks like. So here, notice now I have a character panel where I can make adjustments to the typeface, a paragraph panel where I could adjust how that type is laid out, and some of the other panels that were here before are now gone. If you think that you need to actually customize the interface, there's a pretty easy way of doing that as well. See these little grippy buttons to the left of any of these panel tabs? These will allow you to grab those specific panels and move them around. So I want to be a little more efficient with my text panels. I'm going to move my paragraph panel up into the character window. And here, notice, as I move around, different areas of that panel are highlighting. And basically what this is telling me is when I let go of this panel, it will drop into that corresponding space. So look what happens if I drop my paragraph panel up here to the top where my character panel is set. Now it's going to appear right behind the character panel. If I clicked on these buttons again and dragged down to, let's say, effects, look what happens if I choose this kind of trapezoid shape at the top. Now it's moved it in between the two panels. The rest of the interface is kind of sticky. It's really neat. As you move your mouse between all of the panels, the cursor will adjust based on what you're changing. So see how when I'm in the corner here, I can click and drag and actually adjust in multiple directions. Also, notice how sometimes the panels will collapse, giving you fewer or greater options based on how much you've dragged on the panels. If this is a setup that you like, you can go up to Workspace and create a new workspace and name it whatever you like, and then that will populate your workspace options. Now, before we go, I want to change my workspace back to standard, and then just to make sure that it's exactly the same as the default setting, I'm going to go to Reset Standard and say yes, and choose to reset it to its original layout. So if there's one thing I want you to remember out of this specific video, definitely remember the workflow, but also as you're going throughout the course, make sure to pay attention to what workspace we're working in. That way you can make sure that your interface is always going to match exactly what we're doing at that specific point in time. I like to think of compositions in After Effects much like a stage in a theater. It's the place where you set everything up for your final animation. To create a composition, all you have to do is go to the project panel and click on this button down here at the bottom, or go up to the composition pull-down menu and choose New Composition. In here, we can name our composition or choose a custom preset. For this course, we're going to be using the preset DVC Pro HD 23976, but of course, that's not going to be quite good enough. I like to change things a little bit more by changing the width to 1280, and then click on the pixel aspect ratio pull-down and make sure it's set to square pixels. I like working in square pixels with graphics just because I've found for me, it tends to make things a little bit easier. Now, just for the sake of ease of use, I like to change my frame rate to 24. You can leave yours 23976, but like I said, my comps are going to be built at 24 frames a second. This is a standard frame rate for film. Before we finish, make sure the duration is set to 10 seconds. If yours isn't, just highlight the box and type 1000, and here you'll see you have a base of 10. So when we click OK, we've now created our first composition that's going to be 1280 by 720, 10 seconds long at 24 frames a second. Now I'm seeing that because it's selected here in my project panel. When you double click a composition, it opens up a tab in the timeline and shows you the composition panel here, which currently, since there are no layers in my Comp 1 panel, there are no layers visible in my comp window or in the timeline. So let's switch compositions just by double-clicking the logo animation comp in the project panel. See, when you double-click, it'll bring that project up to the front and show you everything that's in that specific comp. Like I've said before, compositions are made up of layers. So you can see those in your timeline, but also this window is called the comp window, and this is where you can see a graphic representation as to what you're building. You can actually click in this window and move things around if you want to kind of move some graphics around. I'm just going to press Command Z to undo that. But this is also the place where you can change things like the magnification. So if you want to make sure a graphic is sharp, click on the magnification and change it up to 100%. Here you can see my type looks pretty decent, and I'm viewing at 100% magnification. The other thing you want to look at when you're working with comps is this pull down here, the resolution. I'm going to work at full most of the time, but if you have a slower machine, you might want to set it to auto, and it will automatically switch back and forth depending upon the resolution that you've set. A lot of times when you are working with compositions, you may want to actually go back and change a setting. Let's say you created a composition at 10 seconds and you want to make it 5 seconds. Well, to change a composition, all you have to do is select it in the project panel and go up under the composition menu and go to comp settings. I use the key command Command K or Control K on the PC. Now, if we wanted to change our duration, I could just go ahead and change that right now by changing 10 to 0.5. When I click OK, notice that will now change the length of my composition. So I noticed that first in my timeline down here at the bottom, but I could also notice that when I have the composition selected in the project panel because it gives me that preview up here at the top. Now, probably at some point, you'll want to either rename a composition or rename a layer. And it's not quite as simple as you would think. It's not like you can just click on the name or double click on the name and have it change. What you need to do is select your composition and then press return on your keyboard. Now I could rename this template comp and press return to set it. Renaming layers works much the same way. Select the layer and press return. And here I could just call this VIGBLUR and press return. One thing when you're renaming layers in the timeline, if you click on this button up here, it'll change between the layer name and the original source name. So if we click back on that, you can see this is the layer that I've renamed. But when I click on it here, I can see that the actual source is named Video Edit Pre. If I wanted to find this, I could go up in the project panel and actually start to type, hey, look, there it is. So you can search for things in your interface through the project panel. Now, let's clear that out. And now we know how to rename layers. There's one other section of the interface we need to pay rather close attention to, and it has to do with the controls of your comp viewer. So we'll start on the left and work our way to the right, and I'll just point out some of the key ones. Obviously, the first one on the left here will control your magnification. This is the magnification pop-up. Now, the next button to the right looks like crosshairs. Click and hold, and notice we can enable title and action safe. These are settings that we can use for reference in our composition. If we change our magnification back to 50%, now you can see these lines that pop up in the screen. These lines will give us rules, so we should keep all text inside of the inside box and all important graphics inside of the outer box. All right, let's disable title and action safe and jump over to this time button. If you click on this, that will move your current time indicator to wherever you select. So let's say I want to move to 4 seconds. I'll type 400 and just press OK, and notice now my current time indicator has moved to 4 seconds. So as you can see, yes, the comp window and the timeline are tied together. This button that looks like red, green, and blue little circles, if you click and hold on that, that will allow you to view the different channels, much like looking at different channels inside of Photoshop. Now this pull down that says full, if you click on that, this will set the resolution of the image that you're looking at in the comp viewer. I like to try and keep this on auto. The reason being, notice when it's at 50% magnification and I set it to auto, it switched to half. Now, if I hover my mouse over the comp viewer and scroll up, I'm going to zoom into the scene and it will automatically toggle with my magnification to full resolution. The black and white checkered button right here will toggle visibility. In the layer panel, I want you to select layer 2 and click this button right next to the eyeball. This empty switch area, if you click on that, that will solo this layer, so that's the only layer you can see. Now notice in the comp viewer, my view changed. So now if we enable this visibility button, you can see I get the black and white or gray and white checkbox to show me the transparency of my scene. So let's turn off solo for this one layer and turn off transparency. The next two pull downs will deal primarily with viewing 3D compositions. So we will jump into that in the 3D chapter. The last one I want you to pay really close attention to in the bottom of your comp viewer is the fast preview button. If you click on this, this will allow you to switch between different resolutions as you're working. One of the ones I like to work at most is adaptive resolution. This way, when I make changes either in my timeline or my composition window, it will down res what we're looking at, just so it could kind of refresh the animation and give us a preview as to what's going on. If you have your scene at 100% magnification and full resolution, a lot of times you're trying to get exact placement or get a really sharp, clear view of things. Sometimes when you're dealing with a 3D composition, the render time it takes to view that, you may want to click on this fast preview option and change to fast draft or a different resolution. Just understand when you switch this to off, it will redraw the scene at a high render quality. Also, understand with that, at higher render quality, it lowers the refresh rate. So sometimes when you're trying to view an animation, it will take a little while longer to view what's going on in the scene when you're looking at it at a higher resolution. So now that you understand a little bit more about compositions, we're going to dive a little more deeply into layers in our next video. I know I said this in the previous video, but I do really believe that layers are the actors that inhabit the stage, which is your composition. So to explore layers more in depth, let's open the type composition. Double-click the type comp and make sure that you have type down here in your timeline. With the type tab set up, you can see I have 4 layers. And as I click on each one of these layers, you can see things changing in the comp window. So let's select this text layer. I want to point out something. When you are selecting layers in the timeline, it does have an effect as to what you see in the comp panel, but also when you open the disclosure triangle for those layers, you should notice different things for each different kind of layer. So for example, with this text layer, see I have a text option. And if I open that text option, I have path options and I have more options. Now, I'm not going to jump into all the different text things, but if you notice when you're working in the timeline, I can't see any of my other layers. If you end up with a situation like this, use the scroll wheel on your mouse to scroll up and down and roll through the different layers in your comp. I'm going to close this triangle for type because I want to select this vignette here. Now you should notice this bright yellow line that's popped up on my comp window. What this is a mask. I know the mask is applied to the layer because I can see it in the comp window. But if for some reason I couldn't, I could also open up the triangle on the vignette layer and you notice the first option here is masks. And if I open the mask options, you see I have one mask that's applied. Let's close the vignette layer and look at layer 3. In here, notice the icon looks ridiculously familiar. Well, that's because that's the same icon we used to create our first composition. Now you can have compositions as layers. These are known as pre-compositions. Now it's interesting, if you double click a pre-composition layer, it will open that other composition. Now this is an interesting point because as you're learning the interface of After Effects, you may get thrown off by this because right here, now I'm in a completely different tab and the canvas looks different. That's because this is a completely separate composition which contains its own set of layers. Now what's kind of cool about this, any changes I make in this composition will be updated in the other one. So to show you what I'm talking about, let's turn off the visibility of the yellow layer by going over here to the left-hand side. See, layers have these eyeball icons that determine their visibility. So if you're a Photoshop user, that should be relatively familiar. Now to jump back to the other comp, I'm just going to look for it right here in the timeline and click on the Type tab. Now notice that yellow shape is gone out of this composition. So you can switch rather quickly and easily in the timeline between different sets of layers, basically different complete compositions, just by clicking on the tabs. I know we spent a lot of time in here looking at some of the different things that layers contain, but if we move over a little bit further, you should see this effects option here. What this effects little icon stands for, it's letting me know that there is an effect that's applied to this layer. So if we open the triangle for 3, notice the very first option here is effects. So if we open that triangle, you can see I have a color balance setting and a drop shadow that's been applied. If I want to turn this effect off, I can just turn it off here on the left-hand side of the timeline. See, my drop shadow has disappeared and now it's reappeared. This isn't deleting the effect completely, it's just telling After Effects that I don't really want to have this appear in my composition. So let's turn that effect back on and close layer 3. There's one other thing I want to show you other than effects that you can apply to layers. When we select the type layer here, notice it has kind of this outer glow. Now I'm going to zoom into my canvas using my scroll wheel and press the space bar to grab my hand tool so I can move up here so you can see this a little more clearly. On the text layer, if we open up its triangle, yes, we have our text options. Let's go ahead and close that. We also have transform options, which should look pretty familiar. Let's close that for now. We'll come back to that in a quick second. Let's look at layer styles. See, layer styles are exactly what you might think they are if you're coming to After Effects from Photoshop. These are the layer styles that you would have in Photoshop. So if I open this up, you can see I have an outer glow applied, and I can turn the visibility off. I also have a very narrow stroke, which is kind of hard to see. But let's turn on the outer glow. I can make adjustments to this by opening its triangle and then hovering over any of the specific parameter values. And if you click and drag, that will allow me to drag it up to the right or down to the left and make an adjustment as to that specific setting. This works with any of the settings within the timeline. Now, let's close the text layer and move a little bit further over to the right here. These switches in this parent section, if you don't see these in your timeline, you can pop up any of these options at any point just by right-clicking right next to the layer name and going to columns. See, columns are a way of organizing what you're seeing in your timeline on a horizontal level. So right now, I have parent and modes selected. If I don't want to see one of these options, I can just click on it and it will disappear out of my timeline. Now let's move all the way to the right. I want you to pay attention to these solid color lines. See, these lines determine exactly when these objects are going to appear in the composition. Now, this little thing right here, the big yellow guitar pick kind of looking thing, is actually the current time indicator. So if you click and drag on that, it's moving the playhead, if you will, to different points in time, and that is allowing me to see the animation. I can trim when a layer begins just by hovering my mouse over one end or the other. I just happen to be trimming the end point by clicking on the left side. Now, once you hover over, click, and then drag, and notice if I drag it past my current time indicator, I've trimmed the length of that layer. You can also change where that layer lives in the timeline by clicking on it and dragging to the left or back to the right. Now look in the upper right corner of the interface. See that info window? As I clicked and dragged, it gave me really important information, like when that layer is going to appear and when it's going to disappear out of my composition. So I hope you've enjoyed this little tour of layers and have a better understanding as to how the actors function on their composition stage. Adobe After Effects has become the go-to industry standard when it comes to creating engaging and interesting animations. And if you want to become a proficient and talented animator, you'll need to understand and master keyframe animation. Some might say you need to be uber familiar with keyframes. Just remember that a keyframe records the current state of a parameter at that specific point in time in the timeline. The animation is created when there are at least two different keyframes applied to that one parameter. So let me show you what I'm talking about. In our project here, notice in the project panel, if I double-click our animation comp here, we have a composition that has several different layers. I'm just scrolling up and down on my mouse to scroll through the layers. Here we have the words of the logo broken out into pre-compositions. And we can just go ahead and turn those off for now because we're going to focus on animating these shapes here. So let's actually zoom in on the canvas. I'm going to scroll in on my scroll wheel up to about 200%, and then I'll press the space bar to toggle to my hand tool here and just kind of move over. And actually, no, let's go back to 100%. There we go. Make sure you position your canvas so you can see the shapes, but also on the left here, you can see the edge of the canvas because we want to animate this first circle to start from off screen and scroll right into its position. In order to start animating this, we should select this layer. I could do this by clicking in the canvas directly on the object or by going down to layer 4 and selecting it. When it comes to adding keyframes, you want to add them to specific parameters. If we open the disclosure triangle for layer 4, notice we have all of these different transform properties. Since I know I'm dealing specifically with position, I'm going to save some real estate here and just press the letter P on my keyboard. See, that way I can still see all these other layers. That way, if we wanted to animate these other layers, we could easily do that and not have to resize the interface. With this layer selected, I'm going to show you a little animation trick. Since all of the graphics are actually already in the position we want them to appear in, we're going to animate backwards. So move your current time indicator right here in your timeline on the right-hand side here. If I click and drag, let's move it to around 2 seconds. I know I'm at 2 seconds because it actually pops up over here on the left side of my timeline. To create the first keyframe, you want to press the stopwatch next to the position parameter. I want you to note the first time you press the stopwatch is pretty much the only time you want to press the stopwatch when it comes to setting your keyframes. And I'll explain why in a second. If we go ahead and click the stopwatch, notice we've added a keyframe. It appears here in the timeline. Now, since we already have a keyframe on this parameter, anytime you move your current time indicator anywhere else in the timeline, like let's say back to frame 0 here, if I change the position of this object by, let's say, going up to the comp and clicking on it and dragging, notice now automatically, no matter where I drag it, I'm getting a couple different things happening. First thing, you'll see these dots in this line. This is called my animation path. Let's drag it over here to the left-hand side. Second thing you'll notice, here's my keyframe in the timeline. Now I have 2 keyframes and therefore I have animation. Now to preview the animation, what you want to do is press 0 on your keypad. You notice my animation loaded up and my current time indicator is currently moving. I'm going to press the spacebar to stop it. And I want to show you something. See, by default, whenever you load up a RAM preview, it's going to preview in your preview range. The preview range is currently set to 10 seconds, which is the length of this whole composition. So let's move our current time indicator down to around 3 seconds and press N. N is for the end of your playback range. Now, if I press 0 on my keypad, you'll notice, sure enough, it's going to preview only the first 3 seconds of the animation. Again, press the spacebar to stop playback. If you notice, I'm getting a slight little drift on this animation because I clicked and dragged and it's not exactly perfectly straight. And that was because I just visually started clicking and dragging. So what I'm going to do is delete this first keyframe. Now to delete keyframes, it's pretty straightforward. All you do is select the individual keyframe and press delete on your keyboard. Now you notice since there's only one keyframe, there's no animation. If I scrub in the timeline, you won't see any animation. Let me just Command-Z undo that last deleted keyframe. Another way to delete keyframes is to click on the stopwatch, but look what happens. If I click on the stopwatch, all the keyframes are deleted. Now when you delete all the keyframes, wherever your current time indicator is at that point in time is where that object is going to stay. So let's just Command-Z, undo that. And since I only want to delete the first keyframe, I'm just clicking off of both the keyframes so none of them are highlighted. I'm going to select the first keyframe and press delete. If I press home to move my playhead back to the beginning of the timeline, now instead of clicking and dragging directly on the object in the canvas, I'm going to click and drag on the x-axis parameter. So this is x, this is y. So now when it's all the way off the canvas, it's off screen and the animation will animate properly. Now there's one last thing I want to show you about this. It's these little dots here. Notice these dots are all evenly spaced. What these are telling me is the velocity at which this object is moving. This is spatial interpolation, which we'll get to in a little bit. But right now, I just wanted you to note that these little things are here and they're actually showing us something. This is going to move at a constant rate because this is 2 linear keyframes in the timeline. I'll get to what linear means and spatial interpolation and all that stuff in a little bit, but for now, let's preview this animation. Again, press 0 on your keyboard to preview the animation. And press the spacebar when you're finished. Now that you know how to add keyframes and delete keyframes, I'm just going to show you some other little quick commands you can use when you actually start having keyframes in your project. So the first one is navigation. If you want to move back and forth between keyframes, look on the left side of your timeline. See these arrows? If I click this left arrow here, see how it's slightly brighter than the one on the right? If I click on that, it's going to move my current time indicator up towards the beginning of the timeline. Now you notice I can't click anymore because there are no more keyframes. If I click to the right, now it's going to move to the next keyframe. You want to be careful when the current time indicator isn't on a keyframe, because if you click this button right here in the middle, it adds another keyframe based on what the current parameter setting is for that specific object. Since we didn't move anything, it's just the same as this previous keyframe. So I'll just go ahead and delete that. So for navigation, use the arrows in your timeline. You can also use keyboard shortcuts. K will move you down the timeline, and J moves you up the timeline. One last thing to understand is the Uber key. Remember, I said understanding animation is uber helpful? Well, basically that's because the Uber key, it's what I call it, starts with the letter U. And whenever you select any layer that has animation on it, if you press the U key, it will toggle the visibility of any parameter that has animation. Keyframe animation or otherwise, it's going to show you every parameter that's been animated for that specific layer that you have selected. I want to stress that keyframing is most definitely not the only way to make an object move around inside of After Effects. You can use other things like parenting or expressions, but those things are for another time. Right now, you should just focus on remembering where to look for keyframes in the timeline, and remember, understanding keyframes is uber helpful when trying to create animation. Effects are arguably one of the most fun features inside of Adobe After Effects. Some of you Photoshop users might be familiar with filters. Well, inside of After Effects, they're called effects. Rather fitting, right? In this video, we're going to get familiar with some pretty common effects you've probably seen before. We'll learn where effects live inside of After Effects, the basics of applying them, and of course, we'll learn how to enable and disable your effects to speed up your workflow. Much like keyframes, effects are applied to layers. Now, the first way to see if effects are applied to a layer is to look right next to your switches for the effects switch. That will toggle your effects on and off, but if you want to apply an effect, you should select a layer before you go to apply it. Now, the easy way to apply an effect is select the layer, go up under Effects, and then choose the effect that you'd like to apply. So for example, if I want to blur this background layer, now that I have Video Edit selected, I can go to Effects, Blur, and choose Fast Blur. Now with the Fast Blur applied, notice this panel popped up here in the upper left. This is called the Effects Controls panel. In here you can click and drag on a parameter to make adjustments, just like in the Layers panel. So notice when I drag that to 51, my background video is much more abstract. Now you can also add keyframes to effects just by clicking on the stopwatch. Let's just add a keyframe to this effect so we can see what it looks like in the timeline. Now since I've added my blurriness right here, I'm going to select Layer 4 in the timeline and press the U key to open up any animated parameters, and sure enough, there's my keyframe on the blurriness for my fast blur. To delete an effect, you can select it in the Layer panel, or you can select it in your Effects Control panel. Just once it's selected, go ahead and press Delete. Now you notice the effect has been deleted, but my layer has not. So it's very important when you go to delete the effect, here let me just Command Z to undo that, you want to make sure to select the name of the effect before you press delete. Otherwise you run the risk of accidentally deleting the layer. So again, I'm going to click right on Fast Blur and press delete. Now another way to apply an effect is to go to the Effects and Presets panel. Over here, I can browse through effects. So if I want to blur something, I could just say BLUR, and I get all these options. I'm just scrolling through with my mouse to see what's there. And sure enough, we get here and you can see the fast blur is an option. Now this little number here, 32, that's letting me know that this effect will work in 32-bit color space. To apply this, I can drag it up into my comp window, but a lot of times I like to make sure I know exactly what layer I'm applying it to, so I'll drag it right down to the layer itself in the Layers panel. That way, when I let go, you can see I have my effect applied. And again, nothing's happening with this effect until I click and drag and adjust the parameter up. So now that you understand how to preview, apply, and delete effects, I think it's safe to say that using effects can make your creative possibilities a lot more flexible. Now, I feel kind of old admitting this, but I can clearly remember when After Effects used to only exist in 2 dimensions. And since then, moving in 3D space has taken the motion graphics and effects industry by storm. Now, it's important to understand that working in 3D opens not only a whole new host of possibilities for you, it can also be a little like opening Pandora's box. Once you learn how to make objects exist in 3D space, you'll definitely want to learn about cameras. And what fun are cameras if you don't have lights? And in the virtual world of software, with lights come material options. And with material options, I think you can see already we've jumped down the rabbit hole that's called 3D. Now in this video, we are going to learn how to turn 2D layers into 3D layers inside of our compositions, but we'll also learn some of the basics for how to move those objects around in 3D space. And for our own sanity, we're going to stop there for now. So to get started, open the Type composition by double-clicking in your Project panel. Make sure it's the Type layer that's active in your timeline. Now, I want you to look in your Switches panel at this column right here. And if you don't have your Switches panel active, right-click next to the layer name in Columns, and then make sure Switches are enabled. Since I already had it up when I clicked that, I disabled it. But you notice when switches are disabled, there's a button down here at the bottom of the interface for a toggle to re-enable your switches. Now you want to look at the right side of your switches right underneath that 3D box. And for layer 1, go ahead and click that box. And now we've just enabled 3D for layer 1. Now to better see the 3D capabilities, select the layer. Now you notice in your canvas, I have control handles. I'll just zoom in on the canvas by scrolling my mouse wheel, and you can see when I hover my mouse over this handle, that's the x-axis. The green handle is the y-axis, and this blue one, you guessed it, that's z. If you press P on your keyboard, that will open the position data for this layer. And you notice now I have an X parameter, a Y parameter, and a Z parameter. See, if I disable this, you can see I only have X and Y. Now you might have noticed when 3D is enabled that my layer style outer glow has been disabled. That's just one of the things that you have to be aware of when you're switching between 2D and the 3D environment. Now to get back to repositioning this in 3D space, hover your mouse over one of the axis handles in the viewer. Let's choose X and click and drag. Now notice, no matter where I drag, this is only going to move on the X-axis. This is something that I really recommend you do when you're first getting started in 3D. Only click on the axis handles. Here, I'll click on Y. Notice that ensures that I'm only moving in one direction. This is important because when you're in 3D, if you don't click directly on an axis handle and you start to move around, I am moving this around in 3D space, and I'm not exactly sure where I'm doing this. Another thing that's kind of fun about 3D layers is rotation. So if I click on my rotation tool and then go back over my control handles, look what happens. When I hover over the X-axis and click and drag, it's now going to rotate on the X-axis. Same thing with the Y-axis. Again, you want to hover until you see the letters X, Y, or Z. I'm going to press P twice so we can focus on the position data, and then press V to re-grab our selection tool. I just wanted to focus on the position so you can see when we hover our mouse over the Y-axis and move up over this logo here, you notice that this is existing in 3D space, and it did actually move slightly on the Z parameter, and that's just based on how the layer was oriented in 3D space when I started moving on the Y-axis. But that's not what I want you to focus on. The big reason I want you to focus on this has to do with how 3D layers and 2D layers interact. See, this 3D layer is currently the topmost layer, and so you're seeing it in front of everything else in the scene. But if I grab my logo pre-comp and bring it up to the top of the layer hierarchy, it most definitely is going to take precedence over top of the 3D layer, even though the 3D layer may appear to be sticking out into the scene. That's because 2D will always stay 2D, and if it's 2D, then layer hierarchy is what takes priority. Now let's go ahead and bring our logo comp back down into the scene at the layer 3 position. Okay, now select the type and let's move it back down into the scene. And I'm just going to scroll out on my mouse with the scroll wheel so we can see the entire scene. It's kind of confusing when you're mixing 3D and 2D layers when you're only looking at the scene from one view. Now, I'm not going to dive really deeply into this, but I do want you to understand that After Effects is capable of showing you more than one view at a time. In the bottom of our viewer on the right-hand side, there's a pull-down that says One View. If you click on that pull-down, here you can choose a 2-view or 4-view scene. So let's look at this in 2 views. And in 2 views, notice I have my active camera and then my top view. See, I'm not seeing anything else in my top view because the only layer that exists in 3D space is this one layer here. Now, it's interesting, within the multi-view, I can select this alternate view over here just by clicking the viewer, and now I know it's selected because I have these yellow corners highlighted. Now, the reason I'm showing you this, you can switch what you're seeing in each view. So if I switch to this kind of custom view, you can view this sort of from the side. So when I select this layer and zoom in, see, you can see it from a slightly different angle. I know this isn't making much sense because we don't have another layer in 3D space. So let's just enable 3D for our background gradient layer. Now here you can see how this exists in a completely different 3D space. If we switch back from custom view to top view, here you can see my background layer is right here. Since we're looking at it right over top and there's no depth, all I'm seeing is a line. But I can also see exactly where this type layer is in relation to the background layer within a 3-dimensional space. So last thing, if you get into a multi-view, make sure you select your active camera and then go ahead and switch back to one view, and then you'll be able to see exactly what you're looking at before you actually go to render that individual composition. Okay, so now your work has started to take on a whole new dimension, and we didn't manage to completely jump down the rabbit hole. So between moving layers in the timeline or directly in the canvas with the control handles, you'll have all you need to get started working in After Effects in all 3 dimensions. If you're new to animation, you might not be familiar with the terms render or rendering. I like to think of the word render as a fancy word for output. See, when you complete a project inside of After Effects, it's just that, inside of After Effects. Most of the time, you'll want to create some kind of self-contained file outside of After Effects. You know, so you can watch it later, like in a QuickTime player or Windows Media Player. It's important to note that After Effects can create all kinds of files. They don't always have to be video files. You can create still files like JPEG or Photoshop documents. In this video, I'll show you how to render your composition at full resolution. To get started, let's make sure we have our logo animation composition open. When you go to create a render, you want to make sure that you have the composition open that you're going to render. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Now, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the playback range. See, when you scrub through a project or you're working on specific sections, you may have hit N to shorten your playback range so you would have a quick preview in your RAM preview. But when you actually go to render this, After Effects will default to rendering the work area. So a lot of times, if you just want to output the extended comp, there is a switch for that you can change, but I like to just sort of be aware of the work area before I create my movie. Quick way of dealing with that, if you press End on your keyboard, that will automatically move your playhead to the end of the timeline, as long as the timeline is active. See with this yellow line? Now, after pressing End on the keyboard, I can press N to reset my out point of my playback range. Now, when I'm ready to make my movie, I can go up to Composition and choose Add to Render Queue. That will pop up the render queue. The default location for the render queue is down here in the timeline area. I personally like to move it up into the comp area. So I'm just going to click and drag on these little grippy dots right here. If you click and drag up, I'm going to drag up until I get this dark purple line at the top. Now, when I let go, you can see my render queue is dead center right in the middle of my composition. I can go to my render settings to set up my configuration. First thing, if you want to render something full resolution, best setting is probably the best way to leave it. I like clicking on the words for best setting so you can see everything, like I'm going to render it at the best quality at full resolution at the size 1280 by 720. Remember what I said about the preview range or the work area duration? This is where that would pop up. And in the pull down menu here, notice under time span, it's set to default to the work area only. Now, since we reset the work area for the entire length of the comp, notice it's going to start here and end at 9:23, giving us the full 10 seconds of duration. You can choose to render a specific area just by clicking the custom button. And this is where you can tell it, I only want to render 5 seconds or 3 seconds or what have you. I'm just going to press cancel because I do want to render the full thing at full quality. When I click OK, my render settings are set for the size and how long of a clip I'm going to make. The output module will help me determine exactly what kind of file I'm going to create. If I click this pull down button here, you notice I have a bunch of presets that I could use. When you first get started, I recommend not using those presets, but literally just clicking on the word lossless, because then I can make some adjustments under the output module. So my default, since I'm on a Mac, is QuickTime. But if you click on that, you could choose any of the other options like a Photoshop sequence or a TIFF sequence or H.264 if you're trying to create a really tiny file. I'll just click off of that window, leave it set to QuickTime. And in the video output section, this button right here for format options, this allows me to specify the codec. I'm going to click that button and probably leave it the animation codec. I like using animation because that is a full resolution lossless compression. And especially when you're dealing with motion graphics, it's important that you don't compress or over compress your animation. You can click on the animation pull down and choose any of these other codecs. Another good choice are these Avid DNX HD codecs. And finally, for you Apple folks, the Apple ProRes codec is pretty decent as well. But I recommend leaving it animation and leaving the settings at 100% quality and clicking OK. If we had audio in our project, this is where we could select audio for the output, but since we don't, I'll just leave that deselected. When we click OK, we're actually ready to render our project. But let's look at where this file is going to be created on my computer. Click on the words logo animation, and here, this is where I can specify exactly what I want to name the QuickTime file I'm now creating. I'll leave it set for logo animation, but just add _full res to the end of it. And notice where it's actually going to save the file. Now, typically when I work, I have another folder that I use to save my video files in. So for now, I'm just going to render right to the desktop and click Save. All right, now there's one more thing I want to mention before we hit render, and that has to do with the animation codec. Typically, when you render graphics, you want to use something that's uncompressed, and that's why I chose the animation codec. It is a lossless compression, so it is compressed, but it won't degrade the quality, as I mentioned earlier. But it also creates extraordinarily large files. So if you don't have a particularly fast hard drive or a lot of RAM on your computer, you may not be able to play back the animation QuickTimes at full resolution off your hard drive. Again, because it's fully uncompressed. If you just want to preview or share your QuickTime with somebody else to see, I recommend maybe rendering an H.264 video. Again, we rendered animation because if I were to send this to a video editor, I would want it to come in at as high a quality as possible. All right, now we're ready to go ahead and hit render. Now, when you click render, you'll get a preview as to how long it's taking up here in the top with a progress bar that's loading. Now, there's one other thing. When your project's rendering, you can expand the current renderer triangle here and see exactly what's rendering when. That way, if you notice something is hanging up as it's rendering, you can actually go back and look at that specific thing and see if you could make an adjustment so it renders faster. But as you can see right now, this is working perfectly fine. So I'm going to leave it alone and let it finish its render. Now that that's rendered, I just want to tell you one more thing. The RAM preview in After Effects is awesome, and the new caching system for CS6 is nothing short of a huge leap forwards. But don't be afraid to step away from the desk and get comfortable with rendering. I mean, sometimes when you render a project, it's going to take a little while. So I seem to find that a short break and a cup of coffee is the perfect way to shake things up and unlock your creativity while you're waiting for things to render. All right, well, now that our render has finished, let's go to the desktop and watch our QuickTime. I'll make this full screen and press the spacebar so you can see the fruits of our labor. If you've ever used someone's computer who hasn't had their cache and preferences set up properly, I'm sure you already understand just how important those settings can be. Trying to use After Effects without considering how your system is set up can often be a rather trying experience. So let's save ourselves the headache and check out some key preferences and cache settings. On the Mac, to get to preferences, you just click on the word After Effects in the upper left corner of your interface. On the PC, you want to go to the Edit menu and go down and choose Preferences. So I'm going to go back and choose my preferences, and we'll start with the General section. In the General Preferences, you can change the levels of undo, although I recommend just leaving it at 32. Show Tooltips is a great thing that you can leave enabled when you're first getting started within After Effects. See, let me just click OK to show you what tooltips do. When you hover over any part of the interface, after a certain amount of time of not moving your mouse, you'll get a tip that pops up, tells you what the specific thing is that you're hovered over, and it'll give you a key command shortcut. So let's jump back into our preferences and move out of the general section. We can just click Next and look at previews. Now, the previews section, let's click on the GPU information button. In here, you can actually accelerate the processing of graphics processing within After Effects by enabling GPU ray tracing. Now, understand that the devices that are required to enable this require a CUDA driver, and those graphics cards are NVIDIA graphics cards. Now, since this system doesn't have an NVIDIA card, I cannot enable that option. If you wanted to make an adjustment to the texture memory, you can. Just understand that you should never make this more than 80% of the value of the total amount of memory that you have on your graphics card. Now let's click OK and jump to the import section. In here, there's a setting for still footage. When you import a still image, by default, it will set up the length of the composition. But if you want to specify a length for a still image, you could enable this option and change the length. So anytime you import a still, it's that length. Let's go to labels. In the labels section, notice you can change the label for each different part of the interface. How videos are labeled or audio. Just understand when you click on these pull downs and choose the different options, the colors that actually correspond are labeled down here. So if you wanted seafoam to be a different color, you would come down to this drop well, click in it, and change the color. I'm just going to click cancel because I like the default settings, so I'll leave it like that. The media and disk cache section is arguably the most important section in your preferences. The first thing you want to enable is disk cache. If you have a fast external drive that's separate from the drive that you're actually using After Effects on, you want to choose that folder. If After Effects is acting a little squirrely, you want to empty the disk cache. Also, there is an option for conformed media cache. as you're working in your project, After Effects will sometimes create some extra media cache files that it'll reference to make using After Effects a little bit faster. Typically, when I enable a folder for my disk cache, I also change my media cache folder to the same location. And the same general rule applies if After Effects starts acting a little funny. After I empty my disk cache, occasionally I'll empty my database cache as well. Now let's go to video preview. If you had an external monitor or more than one monitor on your system, this is where you could choose the other device to output the video signal. So as you're working in After Effects, anything in your comp viewer would be mirrored in that external monitor. The appearance section is fun. The only thing I change in here is the brightness of the interface. If you want the interface to be really dark, you can drag it to the left, or really bright, you could drag it to the right. Let's click default to make sure we're set at the default settings. Autosave, if you enable this, just understand anytime After Effects goes to save a project, it may take a second to save that file. So try not to save it too often, otherwise I found it just interferes with your workflow. Memory and multiprocessing is another great area inside of After Effects. If you notice, RAM is shared between all of these different applications in the Creative Suite. As a general rule, you should always reserve at least a little bit of RAM for other applications, especially if you have it open for like email or browsing the web or something like that. After Effects multiprocessing. Let's enable render multi-frame simultaneously. This really takes advantage of multi-core systems, and as you can tell, the system I'm working on has 16 core processors. You should also make sure you at least have one CPU reserved for other applications, so as you're working, After Effects doesn't try and take over the entire system. So now, if you want to optimize the settings for After Effects for your specific system, you may want to just click OK and go to the Help section of After Effects. Under the Help menu, if you go to After Effects Help, in there you can type in the search field, Improve Performance. And in that section, you'll see plenty of tips on how to set up your system with its own individual optimum settings. And that way you can have your preferences and your system set up exactly the way you want. If you're at all like me, being creative doesn't always directly translate into being the most organized person. In fact, some of the most talented artists I know have to constantly battle organization on a daily basis. Well, I'm here to tell you that if I can become organized, any of you can become organized, especially when it comes to working with Adobe After Effects. Now, if you navigate in your exercise files folder, under Chapter 1, you should see this folder, this 0110 underscore project template folder. This is named this just for this individual course, but I wanted to show you how I typically organize folders based on my workflow in motion graphics. Now, what you name these individual folders will kind of be customized based on your individual workflow, but I want to show you how I organize things and the theory why I organize things. So first thing, After Effects by itself references external files. So while you can create a lot of things within After Effects like text and gradients and shapes and all kinds of fun new 3D things in CS6, well, also you can import your layered Photoshop documents, layered Illustrator files, video files, etc. So a lot of times as you're working through a project, you'll have to pull in these external files and work with them. Now, when you're finished with After Effects, there is a method for archiving to collect everything and put it in one folder. But I've found when I start a project, if I keep things organized, it just makes life a lot easier. So my basic structure, since most of my life is centered around After Effects, the very first folder I'll create is this 01 underscore AE projects folder. See, I do this because After Effects is number one for me. Now, I will bounce things back and forth between Premiere and After Effects a lot of times because Premiere has amazing editing features. Anytime I have video footage that I work with, I'll put it in the footage folder. You could call this video footage as well, especially with digital video files. You know, when you're not shooting on tape, it's really important to have those files organized in a specific folder structure as well. So a lot of times if I know I'm going to use those for a project, I'll drop them into the footage folder. Now, if you have an external drive, I would create a similar structure to where I would save my media cache and all that other stuff. But if you're only working off one drive, you could create another folder in here just for your cache. Again, I always recommend saving your cache on a separate drive, but that's neither here nor there. Now, this layered files folder is important because this is what I would use to save my layered Photoshop documents and my layered Illustrator files. I tend to save those separately from my flat images being like still photos that I may have taken with like a digital camera. I save those separately just because the layered files I like to import with all their layers intact. So I'll keep that organized accordingly. Now, working files is an interesting folder. A lot of times, especially if you're kind of noodling with creative ideas, you may not necessarily want to import those directly into After Effects. You probably just want to create some working files so you can have that one Photoshop document with 150 layers in it and know that you're not going to be animating all those layers. So I'd save those in working files. Then when I'm ready to actually import into After Effects, I would save them into my layered files folder with all the extemporaneous layers deleted. Now, this last folder, client reference, this is really important if you are working with another client or an art director or something like that. If they give you any reference images whatsoever in email, a lot of times PDF files, JPEG images, if they're like, hey, I want this to look like this, it's important to save that with your project, especially if you're doing like a meeting or something and they're going, well, you designed this, but it doesn't really look quite like it. You can go, oh, really? Well, this is what you sent me, and jump right to that folder. So all in all, this is how I like to organize things. I encourage you to create your own folder structure based on your workflow and what you think works best for you. Now, one last tip. If you take this folder, and in the Mac OS, you can right-click and choose Compress to create a zip file. On Windows, you could use something like WinZip. But basically, when you zip that folder, that you could use as your starting point for any new projects. And the nice thing when you zip it, it will uncompress the folder and still keep the original zipped file as well. So anytime I start a new project, I just go to the folder and unzip a new folder and rename this whatever it is the project that I'm working on. So for those of you who needed just that little extra push to keep things straight, now, hopefully, you have a nice little workflow you can use to keep all your After Effects projects organized all nice and tidy. If you like having choices, you'll like creating compositions inside of After Effects. There are really no right or wrong ways to creating comps. It's just a matter of choosing what's right for your workflow. I know I've already showed you how to create a comp just by clicking this comp button in the bottom of the project panel. You can also come up under composition and say New Composition. So let's start here and look a little more closely at the composition settings. In the Basic tab, the first thing you always want to start with are your presets. So click on that pull down and you'll notice we have some web presets if you want to create some web graphics, and then standard definition video settings, high definition video settings, and look at this down here, film settings. It's pretty cool. Obviously, you can choose any one of these presets and customize accordingly. So I know we did this in the previous video about comps and layers, so I'm not going to do this right now. But just understand, when you start creating compositions, you want to make sure that you're starting at the proper resolution before you create your graphics. So I'll just click outside of that pull-down menu so we can look at some of the other options. If you need to create a specific size, let's say for a live action event where they're using graphics that aren't traditional broadcast sizes. Let's say your client goes, yeah, that display is 2000 pixels wide and it's 16 by 9. Well, you can lock your aspect ratio and then just choose 2000 and notice it will automatically change the height to match accordingly. You can obviously also change your pixel aspect ratio. This is a great way if you're dealing with something that's standard definition, like a down res of a high definition clip. You can choose one of these other options based on exactly what you're creating. The frame rate is kind of interesting. After Effects does not tie your keyframes specifically to an individual frame, kind of the same way Flash does. I can choose whatever frame rate I want because the keyframes are tied to points in time. So when the keyframe is at 1 second, If I render it at 30 frames, it's on frame 30. If I render it at 24 frames, it's on frame 24. Start timecode is a really nice feature if you're working on long-form graphics. A lot of times producers or editors will enjoy having graphics that have a start timecode of whatever matches the project that you're working on. So, for example, a lot of times when people shoot for long form, they'll shoot different hours for different reels depending upon what it is. So, for example, if I know I'm creating a graphic that starts in the second hour of that composition, I'll just say, okay, 2 hours, and just keep hitting 0 until I get to the 2-hour mark. And then anytime I create a composition, instead of it starting at 0, it's going to start at 2 hours, 0, 0, 0. Now, the background color is kind of important. If you want to have a different background color for your composition, by all means you can. Just click in here and choose a different color. Most of the time, if I want to have a different color, it's because I'm trying to make sure that I've cut out something properly for compositing, and I want to make sure there's no extra noise in the background. You'll see me do this a little bit later in the course. Let's click Cancel for now and jump to the Advanced tab. I want you to pay attention to the renderer here. Ours is set to Ray Trace 3D, and that's because the last time we created a composition, it was set to create a Ray Trace 3D renderer. Yours may say Classic 3D. Now I'm going to kind of juggle around with some of the things in here to get this one menu that pops up. But let me explain Ray Traced and Classic really quickly. Think of Classic 3D as the advanced renderer in the previous version of After Effects. Basically, if you're working in a 2.5D project, you can probably use Classic 3D and be perfectly happy. Ray Trace 3D gives you the ability of a full-fledged 3D application. We can have full 3D objects with reflections and refraction and a whole bunch of other things that we'll be getting into a little later. For now, I'm going to change my comp to Classic 3D and click OK. Just so I can show you what I'm talking about, with Comp 1 selected, I'm going to press Command K to reopen its comp settings and jump back to the Advanced tab. See, anytime you want to edit the settings for a composition, you can always press Command K with the comp selected and open that comp up. If we change the renderer from Classic to Ray Trace 3D, when we click OK, you may see this window that pops up, and it's an alert window. It's really important when you first start using After Effects CS6 to pay attention to this, because basically this outlines exactly what features the Ray Trace 3D renderer enables and what features are not rendered by the Ray Traced 3D renderer. As you're first getting started within After Effects, I do recommend leaving this set up once per session. Basically, that way, anytime you relaunch After Effects and you create a new comp and switch between renderers, you'll get this alert that pops up. But if you select Never Again, you won't ever see this. So I'm going to leave this set up to once per session and then click OK. Now that we've edited our blank composition, let's jump over to the type comp. This composition was actually created by importing an Illustrator document with all of its layers. I'll show you how to do that in the next video, and later on there's an entire chapter where we'll talk about exactly what translates from what application and how to properly prepare Illustrator and Photoshop documents for layered import. For now, I just wanted you to understand that you can create those compositions on import. Another way of creating compositions, and this is one of my favorites, is to actually duplicate a previously existing composition. So for example, let's say we wanted to have bumpers, like a graphic that pops up at the end of a segment. And for each bumper, I wanted to have a different message pop up here. Well, I could render this first version where it says turning light into energy, but rather than creating a whole new composition or re-importing Illustrator, it makes a lot more sense to just select the type composition and press Command-D on the Mac or Control-D on the PC and duplicate it. Now when I double-click this second type layer, I can double-click on the T and change this. So now I could render this version and then this version, and we've created multiple comps just by doing a simple duplicate command. Now, even though I've shown you some basics on how to create compositions, what I want you to really understand is how After Effects is designed around the theory of workflows. Whether you're starting from scratch or saving time by creating variations on a theme, The multiple ways of creating compositions in After Effects will become second nature, and more importantly, they'll be centered around the way you work in your specific workflow. What does it mean to import a comp? Well, I know you might be thinking that doesn't sound right because comps are created from inside of After Effects, right? Well, actually, you can create comps as a part of the import process. And when you work with compositions, you'll undoubtedly want to add some footage. After Effects does a pretty good job of guessing the proper settings for each piece of footage imported, but sometimes you'll want or need to change those as well. So let's get started by importing an Illustrator file. One of the great things about After Effects is the fact that it integrates so well with other application files in the Creative Suite, like Photoshop and Illustrator. So if you go up under File and go down to Import, we can go to File. Now, navigate through your browser. I'll navigate to my footage folder in my exercise files folder. In there, I have a folder for Illustrator. So if we navigate in there, select the Kinetico 02 Illustrator file. Now at the bottom, see where this pops up and it says Enable all acceptable files. Leave that at its default. But down here where it says Import as footage, what we want to do is import as composition retain layer sizes. Now we'll cover the retain layer size setting in the next video. When you select Open, now you notice we've actually created a comp. And that comp is based on the Illustrator file that we imported. If we double click this comp, I want you to check out something. First thing, it's only 2 frames long. Well, that's definitely not right. So I'm going to look at what happened here, and you'll notice I have this funny icon that looks like little things stacked on top of each other. And that's because you can actually import still images as image sequences. So I'm going to press Command Z to undo that import and go back up under File and choose Import File. Navigate through your folders to your Illustrator folder and choose Kinetico 02. Choose Import as Composition Retain Layer Sizes, but deselect this Illustrator PDF EPS sequence. Now when we import this, it's going to import properly at 10 seconds duration and the 24 frame rate we've been using up to this point. So if we double click our composition, you can see all of the layers from the Illustrator document have imported and they're in our composition. Now the beautiful thing about this, it maintained the transparency of the Illustrator document. So if you want to see the transparency, in the bottom of your comp panel, go ahead and click this button right here that looks like a checkerboard. If you click on that, that will allow you to see the transparency. See, remember when we were creating comps, you could change the background color? This might be one of those instances where you want to have a slightly different background color. I personally like working on black, so I'm just going to leave that alone. While we imported this file as a composition, I do want to go ahead and import some video for the background, right? So let's import the video. Instead of going up to File and Import, just double click anywhere in this section of the project panel. When I double click, it'll open up the Import File dialog window, and we can navigate back to our footage folder, and under Video, let's open that up and choose the Solar Panels CU movie. Notice it's been correctly identified as a QuickTime, and we'll import this as footage. What's interesting is you can import as an entirely different project, but let's just leave it for footage for now. So when we click Open, notice now the video file has been imported into my After Effects project. So if we want to use this as background video for our project, we can do a couple different things. First thing, if you double click a video file, notice how it opens up in its own layer window in the comp window. This is kind of cool because we can preview our video just by pressing the spacebar. And in the upper right corner of the info window, you want to watch and see exactly how fast it's playing back. So you can see in this example, it's only playing back, well, now it's up to real time, but you see it kind of bounces back and forth. So if you press the spacebar and stop playback, notice our current time indicator is moved. If you click this little button that looks like a left bracket in the bottom of the comp window, that will automatically trim the start point of that video to start where your current time indicator is. Now, we can press the spacebar again to select more of the video time, or I could stop playback and click this little button down here and choose a specific time. Now, if I'm not sure exactly what time I want to choose, but I know I want to add, let's say, another 4 seconds to this, I could type +400, and when I click OK, it'll move 4 seconds down the timeline. So now, if I click on this Out Point button, I've now trimmed this before I've ever added it to my project. This is a really, really helpful feature when you're trying to integrate video into smaller length projects. Because if you look up in the project panel, you can see this clip is over a minute, but our comp is only 10 seconds. So now, if I want to add this to my comp, since my current time indicator is already at 0 seconds, I can just drop it in right on top of all the other ones as another layer by clicking this button on the right. Now you can see my video clip has been added to my composition on the topmost layer. And you can see at its out point, it disappears. Now, obviously, I can extend this out point by clicking on the right-hand side and dragging to the end of the comp. And I can use the layer hierarchy by moving it back to the bottom of my composition window. Now, there's one more thing I want to show you about importing video footage, and that has to do with how the footage is being interpreted. Now, occasionally, you may notice that your video is not playing back exactly properly. Well, that's because sometimes After Effects will interpret the video as something that it's not, like it might choose the wrong frame rate or an improper field order. So to change that, with your footage selected, just go ahead and Control-click on the Mac or right-click and go to Interpret Footage and go to Main. In here, I have options that I could change. Say, for example, I wanted to play this back at, 12 frames a second. I could tell it, conform to this frame rate, and it'll give me a warning about my audio, but since I'm not worried about audio, I don't have to worry about that right now. You can also do interesting things like use the start time code from the footage. And here, under Fields and Pull Down, this is where you can choose whether it's lower field first or upper field first. Now, this really only pertains to interlaced video footage. Down at the bottom here, if the pixel aspect ratio is off, this is where you can change that. I'm going to accept these changes by just pressing Enter on my keypad. Now, had I changed the frame rate or something else, it would be listed up here in the project panel. So now that we've imported a layered Illustrator file as a composition and added some footage, in the next video, we are going to jump into another option that I use quite often, which will allow us to kind of bounce back and forth and change that piece of footage in its own external source, while still allowing it to update back inside of After Effects. I know you've heard me say this a lot, but honestly, this is kind of one of my favorite things about working in After Effects. The ability to import external files as compositions is extraordinarily wonderful, but inevitably, you'll probably want to be able to bounce back and forth and make changes and have them update between both applications. Since in the previous video, we imported a layered Illustrator document, this time I want to import a layered Photoshop document. So double-click in the project panel and navigate in your exercise files folder to the footage folder, and in there, go inside of Photoshop. Click once on Eco Shapes and then make sure that Import As is set to Composition. See, last time we chose Composition Retain Layer Sizes. I want to import as a composition just for an example right now. So when we choose Composition, click Open. Under this menu that pops up, we still have a choice under Import Kind if we change our mind between composition or footage. If I choose footage, I could choose an individual layer or merge all the layers together as one file. But what we want to do is leave it for composition, and we can leave editable layer styles. And when we click OK, this is going to get imported into our project. If we double click our Eco Shapes here, you can see I have a green layer and I have an orangey yellow layer. If I want to use these in this project, I could drag the comp down as a whole. That would be nice because when I drag it down as a whole, you can see exactly what things are looking like. It looks pretty neat, but unfortunately, if I wanted to animate this bar and that bar separately, what I would need to do is open up the Eco Shapes comp and then animate these within this comp. And what I really want to do is use both shapes inside of here. So we can do this one of two ways. We can go up under Eco Shape Layers here, and you can see I've got my actual layers, or I can just come in to my Eco Shapes layers in the timeline and drag a lasso around both layers. With both layers selected, if I go up under Edit and choose Copy, when I bring them into the other comp, I can choose Edit and Paste. Now, notice they copied right in place. If I select the Eco Shapes comp layer, layer 4, I can press delete, and now I have each layer separately. But there's an issue. See, I did bring these in as separate layers. If I turn off the visibility of one or the other, you can see. But when I select the green layer, look in the center of your comp window. This cross here I'll scroll in with my mouse. This is my anchor point. So if I opened up, let's say, the rotation parameter for green by pressing R on my keyboard, I could click and scrub through that parameter. Look at what's happening here. Let me zoom back out. Notice the rotation is actually going to rotate around the center of the layer. And the layer itself is actually the size of the comp. See, if I undo my rotations here, Command Z or Control Z on the PC, you see that I've got my layer here, and it's actually the entire size of the composition. Let me scroll out, see the handles there. That happened because we imported this Photoshop document as a composition, not a composition while retaining layer sizes. So just to start over, I want to go ahead and select our Eco Shapes layers and drag them to the trash right here in my project panel. When I press delete, I still have my Eco Shapes comp. I can drag that to the trash as well. Instead, let's double click in our project panel and import that PSD as a composition while retaining layer sizes. Now when we click open, again, we'll leave the import kind set and leave editable layer styles. When we click OK, you can see if we open our comp, we have both layers and they're separate. But notice now when I select each one of these layers, here, let me open up my rotation. I can actually control where the animation takes place, and by default, it will be centered on each individual layer. Let's undo that rotation. I'm going to collapse layer 1 and select both layers and copy and paste. Notice when I did copy paste, it actually put the layers in place within my comp window. I know you're thinking, this is pretty cool. I've imported these layers and I can animate them separately, and my anchor point is set up properly. But what if I want my anchor point to be on, I don't know, the left-hand side? Well, you want to use the Pan Behind tool, which is up in your tool panel in the upper left part of the interface. See this icon to the right of the little camera? That's your Pan Behind tool. If you click on that, then you can click on the anchor point for this orange-yellow layer, and if I drag it to the left, now when I choose rotation and click and drag, you can see it's rotating around that point. Let's just undo that. This is also very helpful if I wanted to do a scale option here. I could unlink the X and Y parameters and just click and drag on the X, and look, I can make it grow out of the side of the screen. That's pretty cool, right? Well, what if you needed to go back into Photoshop for some reason to make a change? Let's say I want to change the edge of this layer, but I don't necessarily want to add a mask to this layer inside of After Effects. Well, you can quickly jump back and forth between After Effects and Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever file you've imported just by right-clicking on the layer within the timeline. Then choose Reveal Layer Source in Project. That will automatically bring that layer to the front of your project panel, so then you can right-click directly on that layer and say Reveal in Finder or Windows Explorer on the PC. When we're in the Finder, now you guessed it, we just need to double-click the Photoshop document to open it back up in Photoshop. I want to clean up the edge of this green layer, and I want it to have a slight curve. Now I know this isn't a Photoshop class, so we're not going to spend a lot of time in here. I'm just going to grab our elliptical marquee tool. If you see the rectangle one, just click and hold and choose elliptical marquee. Let's start kind of 3/4 to the left side of our comp and click and drag. I'll just reposition this by moving my mouse in the middle of the cursor, and there we go. Let's say I want that to be my new left edge. So I'm going to go to Selection and choose Inverse. So now everything else other than the circle is selected, and press Delete on my keyboard. I knew I could press Delete because I already had the green layer selected in my Layers panel. So it's time to go up under Select and say Deselect, and just File, Save to save the change you've made. If we jump back over into After Effects, notice nothing's really happened. Since the layer is already highlighted, all we have to do is right-click on that layer in the project panel and choose Reload Footage. This will force After Effects to go back to that Photoshop document and then reload the revised version. Notice even now that it's been reloaded, when I click on the green layer, it's now changed the bounding box to this portion of the layer. It's pretty cool to have that interoperability. So I hope you can see how valuable it is to pay attention to what you import when you import compositions, and more importantly, how nice it is that Photoshop, Illustrator, and After Effects all play very nicely together. I want to take a time out here for a second and talk about renderers. As you can see from our project here, it's not very pretty and it's not organized yet. And that's just because we're in the process of getting everything in and just starting to flesh out our animation. Understand that pre-composing is going to be an integral part of that. But before we start really diving deep into pre-composing, what we need to do is understand what renderer we're using. The reason I bring this up until this point, we've been creating comps by importing external pieces of footage, as well as creating them from scratch. Well, when you import external pieces of footage, like the Photoshop document we did in the previous video, the blend modes from those documents will translate into After Effects. And if you're not paying close attention to what renderer you're using, that could be problematic. So for example, if we look at layer 1 here, this was a green layer that was brought in from an external Photoshop document. And if you look over here in our switches area in the middle of the interface, you should see that hard light is a blend mode that's been applied. I don't want you to be concerned about the specific blend mode or how blend modes work. We're going to dive deep into that in the next chapter. Right now, I just want you to be able to see that it's not set to normal. And when your layer is not set to normal, that means you're using a blend mode. Notice with this layer being set to hard light, it looks kind of different in terms of how it blends into all the layers below it. If I press T to open up my opacity, you can see it's at 42%. Well, let's click and drag that up to 100, and you'll see with hard light, it's mixing with the layers below it. Let's go to the composition settings for our Kinetico 2 composition that we're in. Let's move this to the left so we can see our comp window. If you go to the Advanced tab, check this out. Our renderer that we're using is the Ray Trace 3D renderer. Now the problem with this is the fact that this renderer does not support blend modes. Now, I know you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm looking at one right now, it's working perfectly well. And you would be correct. But if I click OK and go back into my comp and turn this into 3D, look what happens. It's going to take a little while to process, but now check it out. There's no blend mode being applied. And as a matter of fact, I can't even see it in my switches panel. So when I get to pre-composing things, if you're not paying attention to what renderer you're using, if you have blend modes in there as well, you're really starting to complicate things. So let's change this back from a 3D layer to a 2D layer. Go into our composition settings, and under the Advanced tab, let's change the renderer from Ray Traced to Classic 3D. Now when we click OK, even if we make this a 3D layer, we still have a blend mode applied to it. All right, now that we've covered that little hurdle about the renderer, now we're ready to actually jump in and understand composing and pre-composing. Pre-compositions are definitely something you can use in After Effects to maintain flexibility. If you want to be able to animate each individual layer as its own object, but then in turn move that object around the canvas as though it were one object, you might want to consider using pre-composing. Now let's look at our project in its current state. Inevitably, as you're working, you're going to look at your project and realize, wow, this is really kind of a mess. And that is a part of the creative process, but if you can keep yourself organized in the creative process, life will be that much easier. So before we create our first pre-composition, let's do some housekeeping. In the project panel on the upper left-hand side, notice I have a couple folders, a QuickTime file, and 2 compositions. The Kinetico O2 comp is the comp that we're currently looking at for our animation. This EcoShapes composition got created when we imported a Photoshop document in a previous video. If you double-click that, you'll see we have these 2 shapes in this comp. I don't need this in my timeline, so I'm just going to click the X right next to the name to close that out. Let's move this comp and these 2 folders into their own folder and call it external files. The reason I want to do this, again, it's just general housekeeping. So with EcoShapes selected, hold the Command key on the Mac or the Control key on the PC and select Kinetico O2 layers and EcoShapes layers. With all 3 of these files selected, now I'm just going to click and drag with my mouse down to the folder in the bottom of the project panel. When I let go, it looks like they've disappeared, but really they're inside of this untitled folder. So in here, let's rename it External Files. And just so you can see, if we open the triangle, you can see here they are. Now let's do the same thing with the QuickTime file. Click and drag the Solar Panels QuickTime file down to its own folder and call this Video Files. Okay, now we have our main comp that we're working on. So, like we said earlier, this looks kind of busy, and I'd like to be able to just click on this logo and drag it as one big piece. I'm just going to undo Command Z. In order to do that, instead of using parenting as a technique or some other technique, I'm going to select these layers by clicking on 9 and shift-clicking on layer 3. So now layers 3 through 9 are selected. And we'll go up under the Layer menu and go down to Pre-Compose. Now there are some options that pop up here, but the only one we can choose right now is Move All Attributes into a new composition. This is because we don't have any animation applied to these layers currently. It's important to stay organized. Whenever I create a pre-composition, I like to end it with the word pre-comp. So I'm going to hit my left arrow so my icon pops up on the left side of the name, and I'll just call this logo space pre-comp, and we can leave the 1 in there. Now when I click OK, I have one comp layer. I can turn the visibility on and off, and I can just reposition that anywhere within my project. Let's click and drag it down to the left and press S to open up the scale parameter, and we'll scale this down. Now 33% seems to be working. We can move it down and out of the way, but you notice it's underneath these 2 layers. So let's click and drag the comp in the timeline up to the top of the layer hierarchy. And here let's drag it back over to the right there a little bit, just so we can see how it's fitting in here. Just in general, when you're positioning objects that have type, you want to click this button here in the bottom of the comp window. That will open up Title and Action Safe. See, in here, you want any words to be inside of this second square. That's called Title Safe. I'll turn this off for now. And let's look at pre-composing, because we have scaled this down, and this pre-comp works perfectly well, just like this. But let's see what happens when we deal with a layer that has a blend mode attached. Just so we can accentuate what's going on here, select layer 2 and press T. That way we can look at the opacity of this layer and click and drag on the value and drag it up to 100%. Graphically, I don't like how this looks, but this is going to accentuate what I'm talking about when it comes to pre-comps. So with green set to 100% opacity, you can see I can still see through it because it's using the hard light blend mode. And again, we're going to jump into blend modes in the next chapter, but for now, just understand that this is applied. So select layer 2 and shift click to select layer 3, go up under layer and choose pre-compose. We'll move all these attributes as well. And again, I'm going to hit the left arrow and just call this bars underscore pre-comp 1. Now when I click OK, these layers have been moved to their own composition as well. Now look what happened to the green. Notice how it's no longer semi-transparent. Yes, I can still see the yellow layer below it, but if we click this button right here next to this little shy guy, notice now the blend mode actually comes back. See? This button right here is called Collapse Transformations. You can see that name when you click and hold on this button. This does two things. First thing, with Collapse Transformations disabled, if I click and drag my bars to the right, notice they're cut off. See, when I collapse my transformations, you can see now this layer is extended. So Collapse Transformations tells this Kinetico O2 composition to ignore any of the parameters set by its current environment, but actually look at how the layers exist on their own. Even if you open up the bars comp, it's still ignoring the edge of that comp because it's really looking at the values of these layers as a whole. Now it also looks at the blend modes. So if we jump back to our Kinetico O2 layer and select our bar comp here, you'll know if we deselect, you can see no blend modes, whereas when we enable collapse transformations, the blend modes are allowed to compute through. So collapsing transformations just allows whatever is going on to go through the different compositions. Now we can reposition this back down into the bottom of our comp, and that pretty much wraps up our overview of pre-compositions. Don't worry, as we continue moving throughout the rest of this course, we're going to dive deeper and deeper into pre-comps and specific instances when you may want to consider using them. Now, I know this composition looks perfectly fine right now, and that's just because the After Effects project can actually find all the external files that are linked to it. But on occasion, you'll open up a project and not be able to see any of the files, or some of the files will be missing. And it'll be kind of terrifying because they'll look like color bars. And the first time I ever saw that, I panicked. I don't want you to panic, so just kind of follow with me as I mess this up and then show you how to fix it. So first thing, with my external files here, I'm just going to open up my Photoshop document, and if you right-click on any file, you can always say Reveal in Finder or in Windows Explorer. So when I reveal that, here's my Photoshop document. I'm just going to do something kind of scary and drag this to the trash. Do not do this on your system, but when you do that, I can come back in here and then right-click on here and say Reload Footage, and it's saying, oh, it can't be found. And then these are the color bars that you will see. You can make footage offline, like if this is something you're trying to do, you can right-click on a piece of footage and then say replace footage with a placeholder. And if we just click OK, it'll do kind of the same thing. But basically, anytime you run into this problem, you can always relink the footage. Since I didn't actually move the Illustrator file at all, I should be able to right-click on it and just say Reload Footage, and it goes back into the Finder and finds it. But sometimes that doesn't happen. So if you right-click on it and go to Replace Footage, I can go to File, and then navigate to my footage folder in my exercise files, and under Illustrator, here at the top, just to remind myself what it is, it's saying it's the blades layer of Kinetico O2. So let's select Kinetico O2 and choose Open. And then it's going to say, okay, is this all layers or can I choose a layer? So select Choose Layer and click and choose Blades. Now, the only other thing you want to look at is the actual dimensions of the file that you're reconnecting. Now, as I look up here in the left side of my project panel, I can see it's only 281 by 242 pixels. And I know that I would never create a composition that small, so I'm going to choose layer size for my footage dimensions. Now when I click OK, that will be relinked and it populates just perfectly well. We can do the same exact thing for this Photoshop document, but if I click here and say Replace Footage and go to File, I would obviously need to move that back into my Photoshop folder. So let me cancel this really quick. And in my Finder, I'm going to pop open the trash and drag my Eco Shapes layers back up into the Photoshop folder. Now when we jump back into the project panel, I can right-click and try reload footage, and nope, okay, I'm gonna have to replace footage. I can go to my file options here and navigate in my footage folder to the Photoshop folder, choose Eco Shapes, and unlike the last time, when I relinked, After Effects did find the other missing item. A lot of times, if you have multiple items within one folder that are missing, you can relink and it will find all of the subsequent files. So you don't necessarily always have to right-click and find those files. Now, one last thing, on occasion when you open After Effects projects, you'll get an error message saying that it can't find certain items. If there are a lot of those items and you have a lot of folder structure in your project panel, if you click up here and start typing the word missing, any file that's missing will actually pop up here in your project panel, and you can right-click on those and go through the same process that we just went through when it comes to relinking footage. I wanted to start off this chapter by clearly defining what layers are in the context of After Effects. Even if you have exposure to layers inside of Photoshop, layers in After Effects are organized in a very interesting fashion. Compositions are the containers that the layers reside in. But what I rather find curious about layers is just how different all the various kinds of layers can be. Some layers are only generated from within the composition. Those are called synthetic layers, since After Effects is synthesizing their creations. So if we look at our Kinetico 2 composition right here, you'll see we have a number of layers in our comp. Now I'm just going to move up the timeline so it's a little more dominant in our view. Now the first layer in layer 1 is actually a shape layer. Shape layers are rather interesting because they are created within the composition of After Effects. If I went up into my project panel and tried to search for shape layer, it's not going to find it. It'll find the shapes Photoshop document I imported earlier, but it will not find this individual layer. I would have to search within the timeline to find something like that. Now let's clear out that search, and back on layer 1, if you open the triangle for a shape layer, you see I have my transform options that every single layer has, but I also have a contents layer. And the way layers are organized inside of After Effects, you have these different sections, and they keep drilling down with different triangles. So this layer, if you can see it here in the composition, here I'll scroll in just a little bit and hold the space bar and click and drag to move the composition up, you can see it's actually a rectangle and its opacity is 60%. See, if I change this up to 100, you could see it a little more clearly here. Interestingly enough, with the contents for a shape layer, I added a rectangle path. And that's where I set exactly how long it was going to be and how many pixels tall. There's also a fill that's applied, and within the fill, it has a color. We'll get more into shape layers later in this chapter, but I wanted you to look at how layers are organized overall in terms of these individual sections. It's kind of organized almost like an outline would be. If you select layer 1 and press the U key, it will hide anything that you currently have open. Now, select layer 2. This is a text layer. This is very much like a shape layer in that it's a synthetic layer. It's generated within the composition itself. So the way to add a text layer, we use the text tool up in our tool panel. But for now, open the triangle on layer 2. And here you can see we have text options and path options for that text, as well as more options for the text. Now, what's interesting is there's this flyout button that says animate. And if we click on that, you can change things for your text, like the fill color or give it a stroke. But we'll jump into that in a little bit. Now I'm going to close more options here and open the shape layer. And I want you to notice that it's organized in a very similar fashion. See how the shape layer has contents and then 2 sections, and text layers have text, and then I have my path options and more options. It's just something to note. Once you learn how layers work for one kind of layer, chances are it'll work in a similar fashion for the next kind of layer. Now, comp layers are fun because they contain other layers. If we open up that triangle, you see I do have an effect applied to that layer. I can also see that here in the effects area of my switches. And if we open the effects, you can see I have a drop shadow applied. If we close 3, let's look at 4. This is actually called a solid layer. And while this is being created within After Effects, it is also something that is footage you can reference in your project panel. See, if I right-click on my solid layer, I can say Reveal Layer Source in Project. And when I do that, you can see there's actually a solid that exists within my composition. This is nice because if I wanted to add another layer solid, I wouldn't have to come up under Layer and choose New Solid. I could literally just drag it and drop it down into the timeline, and now you can see I have a second layer. Now, the reason this is dominating my view, I put it at the second layer and the rectangle shape layer is above it. If I delete this layer solid, you notice, well, this one isn't dominating my view, and that's because it has a mask applied to it. Layers can contain masks, and if I open the triangle, you can see the very first thing that's applied is this mask. Again, we'll explore this later in the chapter, but the last kind of layer I want to show you is an adjustment layer. See, if we change the magnification of our comp in the lower left corner of the comp window, change it to fit up to 100%. Now, when I expand the view here, you can see that my background video layer is blurry. I just scrolled with my mouse over the comp window. If you move your mouse over the timeline and scroll, you can see you can scroll up and down within the timeline. With this adjustment layer, notice I have an effect applied. But if we look at our video layer, the solo layer down here, I'm going to expand the width of the name column just by clicking on this dash. Here you can see this video layer does not have an effect applied to it. And you might be thinking, well, how is that blurry? Well, an adjustment layer is in essence an empty or transparent layer within After Effects. But what it allows you to do is apply effects to that layer. So notice if I open that up, I have a fast blur applied to the adjustment layer. The way they work, any layer that's below them will be affected. So if I drag this adjustment layer all the way up to underneath Charlie Winter's name, now look, everything is blurry that's below that layer. Okay, so now that we've seen the overview of these different kinds of layers, let's go ahead and jump in and actually cover these layers more in depth throughout the rest of this chapter. Text animation is one of the things that After Effects does extraordinarily well. Out of all the things that After Effects does extraordinarily well, text has got to be in the top 5. Because I have to say, text animation in After Effects is pretty amazing. But before you can start animating text, you need to be comfortable with actually just adding text to your compositions. Now, the first time you ever add text to a composition, I want you to pay attention to one thing. It's down here in the comp viewer on the left-hand side next to your magnification pull-down. If you click on that button, notice there's an option for title and action safe. Go ahead and select that. And these lines that pop up are guides. And basically, any important graphics should be inside this first large rectangle, and any text should be inside of the next rectangle. Now that we can see our graphic is clearly inside of these boxes, I'm just going to use these graphics as the guidelines for adding our text. So let's turn off title and action safe by clicking on the button and reselecting it again. And to add text to our composition, just go up to your tool panel in the upper left and click on the text tool. Now, I want you to pay attention to this switch over here because it may very well be active on your computer. If it's not, go ahead and select it. Now, let's grab the selection tool and grab the text tool. See, with auto panels selected, these two panels automatically popped up, the character panel and the paragraph panel. If this wasn't selected, I can click this button here to toggle the visibility of the character and paragraph panels. Now, whenever you add text to your projects, you should have these panels open. And as a matter of fact, if you're adding a lot of text to your project, you should go up to the workspace and reset it to text. I'm just going to leave it the way it's set up right now because this is kind of working for me. In the character panel, you should pay attention to what we're actually going to set up to be our text. So first thing on the right here, this is where you can set the color of your text. Now, this other box that's right here will allow you to create an outline around your text if you like. I like leaving that empty and just let's leave this white for now. the typeface we'll use is Myriad Pro, and we'll use the bold style. If yours isn't bold already, go ahead and click on that pull down and choose bold. Now when you hover your mouse over the viewer, you should see the eye bar with a box around it. This lets us know where we're going to set our text. So let's click just to the right of our logo in the bar, and now you can see a cursor has appeared. So we're ready to start typing. I'm going to add the name Charlie Winters. Now, a lot of the time when you're creating a lower third, you want to have somebody's name and their title. So let's press return on our keyboard, not on the keypad enter, but return on your keyboard to add a second line of text. Here, we'll call Charlie our news anchor. We need to stylize this text because it's definitely way too dominant. So even before we set this text, bring your mouse up to the right of the anchor and you see I have an eye bar. So if you click and drag, this will select the text. Now, as a general rule, when I'm creating text, I like to not use more than 2 typefaces in a project, or at the very least, no more than 3. With this logo here, I think this is going to be okay as long as we keep Myriad Pro as the overarching family. We can add different styles for everything else. So let's change the news anchor style from bold to italic. Perfect. Now we can change the size just by clicking and dragging in the value here and bring that back down. Now there's still a little bit of space between the first line and the second line, and we can adjust that over here on the word auto. If you click and drag, that will allow you to make an adjustment for the leading. I like this, but I still want to draw some definition between Charlie's first name and Winters, the last name. So if you press the left arrow key on your keyboard, that will deselect news anchor. And if you press it one more time, notice your cursor will pop up to the next line. Now, if I hold down Shift and keep hitting the left arrow, I can select multiple letters. Now, if I want to change the style of the last name, go over to the bold dropdown and just click inside of it to make sure that bold is highlighted. If you just use your up and down arrows, you can actually scroll through all the different options. I want to choose regular as the option. Now I think this is looking pretty good. To set my text, I'm going to press Enter on my keypad. You can also come up and grab the selection tool. When I initially pressed Enter on the keypad, all it did was deselect my bold. So the entire 2 lines of text was set when I grabbed my selection tool. If I wanted to preview other typefaces, I could go over and highlight Myriad Pro and start pressing up and down, but since I've done all this other formatting, that would actually blow all that work away. So typically when you're previewing typefaces, you want to choose exactly which family you want to use first before you start creating styles. This was a basic introduction to text. If you're really into text and text animation, we've got a whole chapter in Chapter 8 you should definitely go check out. Layer solids, also called color layers, are some of the most basic elements you can create within After Effects. And even though they may seem kind of basic, they're one of the most flexible elements you can create within a composition. Now, if you're joining me from the previous video, you can see we have a lower third graphic here. I've just taken this entire composition, I added a little drop shadow to the text, and then I dropped that into a new layer solids comp. Now in here, I'm just going to use this as reference so we can create some new shapes to kind of mimic this shape here. So to get started, I want to use a layer solid. To create a layer solid, you can go up under the layer menu and choose New, Solid. Now, if you ever go up to the top menus and you don't get this option here, chances are you have the project panel active. You need to have the timeline active. That way, when you go to create your layer solid, After Effects knows which composition you're going to place it in. So when we click solid here, the solid settings will pop up based on whatever solid you created the last time. So I happen to create a cyan color the last time. Yours may be white. Regardless, down here at the bottom, you can change the color. If you just click in the color well and drag anywhere in this color area here, let's say over towards white, that would work. Or if you drag over to the right side of the color wheel, you can see this is more saturated. So let's drag over there, and then this bar here with the two arrows, if you click on one of those arrows and move down, you can choose a different hue. So I'll choose something relatively green and click OK. Now, if we really wanted to mimic something from the graphic, we could click the eyedropper and then click directly on, let's say, this yellow-orange shape here. The other thing you need to pay attention to with layer solids are their actual dimensions. You can quickly make any layer solid any size. For example, if I wanted a square, I could say make it 200 pixels, and I'll press Tab to jump to height and say 200 pixels. Now, notice the aspect ratio is 1:1. We're using pixels and square pixels. So when I click OK, we'll have a square in the middle here. Now, most of the time when you're working with layer solids, what you want to do is make them the size of the composition, especially if you're going to animate a mask on that solid. But before we do that, I want to show you why you would probably want to animate the mask as opposed to the solid itself. See, any layer solid you can add a mask to by going up to your tool panel and either choosing one of these shape options by clicking and holding, or grabbing the pen tool if you wanted to create a custom shape. Let's do something rather simple and click and hold on the rectangle tool till you get down to the ellipse tool. In here, since we still have layer 1 selected, when I click and drag just anywhere in here, notice I'm getting that ellipse. But look what happens if I start dragging off the edge of that solid. The edges of the solid appear. So typically, if I know I'm going to be making a custom shape and I want to use layer masks to create that shape, I won't just use a small solid. I'll make it the comp size. Now, since we've already created this solid, let's make sure the layer solid is selected and go up under Layer and choose Solid Settings. You could also use the keyboard shortcut Shift-Command-Y or Shift-Control-Y on the PC. Now with the new solid settings set up, I can say Make Comp Size. When we choose that, it's automatically going to change the solid to the new size of the layer. Now notice when it did that, it also changed the size of the mask. Now rather than having to deal with changing where the mask is and figuring out where the solid is, it might be easier just to start over. So if you ever need to delete a mask off of a layer, go ahead and select the mask. Notice I'm not selecting this group here that says masks. I'm selecting the actual mask itself, mask 1. When you click on that in the timeline and press delete on your keyboard, that will delete your mask. Let's turn off the visibility for this layer solid. In order to create this parallelogram shape, what we need to do is start with something that's relatively close. So if we go back up to our shape tool and click and hold, instead of choosing ellipse, let's choose the rectangle tool. Instead of dragging anywhere in the canvas, one of the tips I can offer when you're working with layer solids and you're making shapes, you want to start actually in the center of that layer. That way, when you click and drag, if you hold down Shift, you'll keep it square in proportions, but if you hold down Command or Control on the PC, along with Shift, you can keep it square and scale it in a 1:1 proportion. I'll make it roughly the same size, just visually kind of eyeballing it, and I'll go back and grab my selection tool. I have all 4 of these layer masks active. Here, let me zoom in here so you can see it a little better. And I'll actually turn off this lower third background so you can see it over black. And now with all 4 of the control vertices selected, I can click on the mask and move it. So I'm just going to press Command Z to undo and click outside of the mask to deselect. And then in order to get that parallelogram shape, I'll click on one and then hold down Shift and click on another. Now you can see that these 2 are selected and these 2 are not, because if I zoom in again, here you can kind of see the black edge around the not selected points. All right, now let's zoom back out. Now all we have to do is click on this edge and drag. Now as we're dragging, you want to hold down Shift. That way it will snap as you're dragging. So unfortunately, I started dragging in one direction too far before I held down Shift, so I'm just going to Command Z to undo that, and click and then hold down Shift and drag only to my left. There we go. Now I've got my parallelogram. And if I wanted to be really precise, I could turn the visibility of the other layer on, press my spacebar and click and drag to move over. And then to quickly select all 4 points of the mask, if you just click on the mask name in the layer panel, notice it won't just select all 4. You need to deselect it and then click on it. And then all 4 will be selected, so we can drag it down here. Now it's important to note, as I'm dragging this down, if we actually go to this pull-down menu next to the mask where it says Add, if you click on that and choose None, and we zoom out in our canvas, you can see we have not moved the layer solid itself. All we've been doing is moving the mask. If I grab one of the anchor points, I can move the mask anywhere, and it will always be full inside of the composition. Let's change this switch back to Add. And here you can see it's cut that shape out. If we change this switch to Subtract, now it's switched to the inverse. Let's go back to Add. And there's one last thing. If you open the triangle next to Mask 1, notice you can keyframe the mask path. This is how you would actually create animation with this shape. If we wanted it to move from one side to the other, we just add a keyframe for the mask path, move our current time indicator, and then move the mask. Now we've created an animation. If you scrub in the timeline, you can see we've created a layer solid shape using masks, and we've applied basic animation. Now, before we jump into creating shape layers, it's important to understand that the creation of shape layers and the creation of layer masks are remarkably similar. And honestly, you just have to be careful what layer you have selected, or if you have a layer selected at all, if you are trying to create a shape layer. Now, in the previous video, I showed you how to use layer masks to animate geometric shapes. Now, in this video, I want to show you a more traditional use of layer masks. So we have this footage of our talent shot on a green screen, and you notice there's a black edge around this footage. So even if I keyed this out, which don't worry if you don't understand what keying is, we have a whole chapter to that dedicated later on in the course. But to jump back to layer masks, since we have layer 1 selected, if we come up to any of our shape tools, let's use the rectangle tool. I'm just clicking and holding, choosing the rectangle tool. If you click and drag now in your viewer, I can draw a mask around our talent, and now you notice I've cut that black edge off the mask. This is a very traditional way of using layer masks, and it's actually called a garbage mask. Now, like I said, we're going to get into green screen keying a little later, so for now, let's hide layer 1. Now, the key to making a successful shape layer, make sure you don't have any layers selected in your timeline. I like to do that just by clicking underneath of the layers, and now you can see neither one of them are highlighted. Now, when you go up to the tool panel, click and hold, and let's use the ellipse tool. We're going to create an ellipse in our viewer, but before we do so, I want you to look at the fill and the stroke. These attributes are going to be applied to the shape that we're going to end up creating. So I want to choose a different color. So click in the red box next to fill and grab the eyedropper tool, and let's choose that green. Now, if we click OK, we're going to make a green shape. Now, for the stroke, I want to use the yellow. So let's click in the stroke box, and then here, see we have the eyedropper. Go ahead and click on the eyedropper. When you click in the yellow, then you can click OK. Now, this next value here will create a width for the stroke. But let's click and drag in the viewer to actually create our shape. If you hold down Shift as you drag, it will keep that shape in proportion. When I let go, if we zoom in by scrolling on the mouse wheel, and then deselect this shape by clicking in the timeline just anywhere off of any of the words or switches, you can see we do have our yellow outline and a shape layer has been created. Now, shape layers work in a very similar fashion to type. Remember when we looked at type, there were a bunch of different subgroups underneath the main group. When you create a shape using one of the shape tools, there is an option like ellipse, since we use the ellipse tool. Now, when we expand that, you can see I can adjust the ellipse path, where we could keyframe the size or the position. We can adjust the stroke separately. One of the fun things to do with the stroke, instead of it being solid, you can add dashes. Now, the fill here is where we can set our color. Notice there's an option for transform for the ellipse. So for example, with this, if I go to rotation, it is going to rotate, although it's a circle. So let's look at adjusting the position. If I click and drag, notice it's adjusting the position around its center point. Now, if we adjust the anchor point, let's drag it up here and then click and drag on our rotation, you can see now it's actually rotating around its own anchor point, which is -138. If you want to change this animation, understand that the transform options for the layer itself are slightly different. Notice if I drag rotation here, it's rotating around the center point of the layer. So you do have transform controls for the layer itself as well as each individual shape. Now this add button functions in a similar fashion to the text. You can add a parameter to animate. So for example, if I wanted to add a different fill, I could select that and notice now this new fill is overriding the original fill. And I could keyframe its color and its opacity. See, if I click and drag its opacity down to 0, check it out. Now it goes back to green. Now, in order to see this more clearly, if you look in the upper left corner of your keyboard, just under the escape key, there's a tilde key. If you select that, with any panel that's active, After Effects will automatically make that panel take over the entire interface. This is excellent if you're dealing with something like this when you know that, okay, I want to create a shape that has red at its starting point and I want it to fade to green. Well, I can adjust my red here and my green there. I don't necessarily need to see my viewer. So if you press the tilde again, we'll snap back to the way the interface was before. We could do the same thing on the canvas. Just make sure before you click in the canvas again, you want to grab your selection tool. Now with the selection tool selected, let's click in the canvas and press the tilde key one more time. And here you can see we have a full screen preview of this individual panel. I have to say, I always was a fan of creating shapes just by using masks on layer solids. But since shape layers came into the scene, I love the fact that you don't have to worry about whether or not the shape fits on the solid. Since the shape layers are synthetic, After Effects is going to draw the shape no matter where it lives in the comp. So draw away to your heart's content. And by all means, don't hesitate to add a keyframe or two and build some animations. Now that we've started to learn how to create different kinds of layers, let's see how we can use switches and modes to add yet another layer of flexibility to our compositions. In this video, we're going to blend our graphics into the background video and also use the transparency data of one layer to create a mask for another layer. Before we go too far into blend modes, it's important to remember which renderer we'll be using, as the ray traced renderer does not support blend modes, track mats, or layer styles for 3D layers. Now, even though we don't have any 3D layers in here, it's still important to make sure the comp is selected and press Command K, because we want to go to the Advanced tab and just get in the habit of changing the renderer from ray traced to classic if you know you're going to be doing a lot of blend modes. So let's press OK. And now I want to look at our comp a little bit closer. If we hover our mouse over the canvas and scroll up with our mouse, then we can press the spacebar to grab our hand tool and move in a little more closely. I want to start with this Charlie Winters layer. And we're going to look at modes first. Now, if you don't see this column of modes right here, you need to go to this button in the lower left corner of the timeline. This second one in will toggle your modes. Within the modes, we have the modes and track mats. Let's start with modes. If we click on the normal pull down here and then scroll down so we can pop this up a little more clearly, you can see these are actually divided into groups. While I'd love to sit here and go through each individual one of these, we don't have time for that. We have to learn After Effects as a whole. So I'm going to give you a tip. When you look at these, you want to look at them in groups and then kind of choose different ones within the groups based on what you know about how that group functions. To give you a quick overview, the first category is the normal category. So that's how layers typically work with transparency and that kind of thing. The next layer here, this is called the subtractive category. I like to think of it because it darkens things. So let's choose multiply for the Charlie Winters layer, and you'll notice that any white pixel is actually knocked out. And since it had a black drop shadow underneath of it, we can still see that. You can definitely click back into your modes and choose some of the other ones to see how they function. But let's move to the next one. This is the additive category. These modes tend to lighten colors by mixing with the layers below. So let's choose screen. See, when we choose screen, any of the black pixels are knocked out, and then the white pixels are allowed to show through. I'm specifically using this Charlie Winters layer because it is black and white. But things get a lot more interesting when you start blending color layers. So let's change our text layer back to normal, and then I'll show you some of these other groups. If we select our cyan solid right here, if I turn its visibility off and on, you can see it does have quite an effect in terms of building our graphic. But it's already set to a multiply mode. Now, just so we can accentuate how things are working, let's press T to make sure that our opacity is set to 100%. Now, with the cyan solid selected, let's go back into our modes and look at the next group. The next group is called the complex category. These modes blend with the layers below depending upon how bright or dark the colors are underneath or above 50% gray. The difference category is interesting because it kind of compares the layer that we have selected with the layers below, and then it blends those together based on how different they are. So let's just choose, let's say, classic difference. And here you can see we've created all kinds of funky colors. Now, obviously, that's not quite the look I'm going for, but hey, if you wanted something bright and colorful, that's always a great place to go. This group down here is kind of interesting. It just blends one color with one or more colors of the components of the layers below, whether it's the hue, the saturation, the color, or the luminosity. I just like to think of this as it plays with the colors, and if I choose the different ones, I can see how that works. If you really want an in-depth look at all of these different modes, you should definitely check out Deke McClellan's course in our lynda.com library. It's called Photoshop Masking and Compositing Advanced Blending. Now, this is a great course, and even though it's in Photoshop, the engine behind Photoshop and After Effects is the same when it comes to blend modes, so anything you learn in there will directly translate into After Effects. Now for these last two groups, I will come back to these momentarily after we learn about track mats. To use track mats, I want to go back up to our Charlie Winters layer. Let's select that, and we can leave our cyan set to this classic mode for right now. Now with our Charlie Winters layer, the way track mats work, even though I want to use Charlie Winters as the source, you need to start with the layer directly below the text layer. Now, if I'm looking at the layer below, it's our Kinetico logo. And since these don't overlap, I'll just move the Charlie Winters text right above our cyan solid. Now we should be able to see how this works. If we select our cyan solid layer and go over to its track mat pull down and choose alpha mat, notice it's automatically looking at the layer directly above Charlie Winters. So if we select Charlie Winters, now it's going to use the alpha transparency of the Charlie Winters layer to generate a mat. Now it's also creating an interesting mix because after it's using the alpha channel of the type to create a mat, it's also still blending the cyan color with the background layers. I know you're thinking, well, what if I want this type to cut out absolutely everything below it? Well, you wouldn't want to use a track mat for that unless you were planning on taking all the layers below and pre-composing those layers. I know in previous videos we talked about pre-composing and how blend modes transfer or don't transfer based on the collapse transform button. But honestly, this little tip I'm going to show you is going to save you having to think about that. So let's change the alpha mat track mat back to no track mat, and then select the Charlie Winters layer, click on its mode pull down, and if we scroll down to the bottom, the last two groups are kind of fun. These are the matte categories. And basically the way they work, they're going to take the alpha data or the luminance data and create a stencil or a cutout of that layer and apply that to every single layer below it. So let's choose stencil alpha, and notice nothing's happening because we need to turn on the visibility of the text layer. Once we do that, notice both the text and its drop shadow are cutting through all of the layers below. And if I took this layer and moved it down, you notice it's not going through this other shape because this shape layer is above. So if you want that cut out, just move it below the text layer, and now that's cut out as well. I'm going to stop here because I think I've given you quite a lot when it comes to learning about modes and track mats. Really, I have to say that I have a secret love affair with switches and blend modes. See, track mats give you the flexibility to animate a source and know that any changes will be updated in the mat because that layer is always being referenced. Now, I think blend modes are awesome because I view them as the secret sauce for getting all of my layers to work together to create one cohesive look. Now, in this video, we're going to take what we've learned about creating masks on layer solids and creating shape layers, and just sort of continue building by creating some complex masks and custom shape layers using the pen tool. So to get started, let's look at our scene. On the left, we have the Kinetico logo with this neat sun effect in the upper left. Now, on the right, we have our yellow solid with a mask. Now, what we're going to do is bring the sun into the corner of this area, and we'll do that by using more than one mask on this layer solid. Go up to the rectangle tool and click and hold until you get to the ellipse tool. Now I want to draw an ellipse in the upper left corner of our yellow solid. So if you click and drag, we can start creating an ellipse. Now, after you start dragging, hold down Shift, and that will keep that shape in proper proportion. As I'm overlapping these two shapes, I'm running into a problem. Well, the first one is the fact that they're both filled with the exact same color. But the second one is the fact that they literally are both the same colors in terms of the mask. What we need to do is make mask 2 a little more high contrast from mask 1. And to do that, if you go on the timeline, next to the word mask 2, there's a yellow square. Go ahead and click on that and change that yellow square to a blue square. Now, when we click OK, having chosen blue, you can see we have a blue square and our path is now blue. Now, whenever you have a path like this that is already selected, you can press V to grab your selection tool and click on any one of these vertices to move the path around. I'm just trying to recreate this sort of sun layer over here. So I'll just use the previous one as a reference. And now it's time to go down to layer 1 and see how we can adjust the interaction between these two masks. If you click on mask 1 and click on mask 2, you'll notice to the right, we have pull downs. If you click on the pull down, you'll see we have options. If I chose none for mask 2, notice there's nothing going on within this mask. Now, it's hard to tell whether or not it's doing anything with this layer above because I have add set for mask 1. So if I say none for mask 1, now all of a sudden you can see the entire layer solid. So let's change both of those back to add. And I want you to go to mask 2 under the pull down and choose subtract and see what happens. If you're at all confused, it's easy to think of masks in terms of a math equation. So you could say mask 1 is added to the scene and mask 2 is subtracted from the scene. That way you can see the final answer is going to be mask 1 minus mask 2. If you click on the mask 2 pull down again and change it from subtract to intersect, sure enough, mask 1 gets added to the scene and mask 2 will intersect with that, meaning anywhere it's intersecting, it's going to fill it in. So now that you understand how multiple masks on the same layers work, let's look at creating a custom shape using the pen tool. In order to make sure that I'm not adding yet another mask to layer 1, let's collapse layer 1 and just click anywhere off of the layer in the timeline. Now, I want to add kind of some squiggly lines to appear around the outer side of this sun. So to do that, let's grab the pen tool up in our tool panel and look to the right for the different options for the pen tool. The first thing I want you to pay attention to is all the way over to the right. That's the Roto Bezier option. If yours is selected, I want you to deselect that. Basically, that gives a different set of controls to your pen tool that are formatted for rotoscoping, which we're not going to get into. So just make sure this is deselected. And then on the fill option here, hold down the Alt key on the PC or Option on the Mac and click not once, not twice, but 3 times till you cycle through and get no fill. Now, the stroke I want to leave on there, but instead of it being 2 pixels, let's click on the number and change it to 6. Now we've got our pen tool ready to draw. I'm going to start maybe down here at this kind of 45-degree angle. Click and release to make the first point. Move your pen tool off to the side and click and drag for your second point. When you click and drag, you'll get the Bezier handles. So let's move back up here and click and drag to make another point. And we'll go back here, click and drag. And now you can see I've kind of got this wavy shape. It's not quite exactly what I was looking for, but I want to show you how we can tweak this. If you move your pen tool back over any one of these control vertices, you can click on one and then move it. I could click on the first one and then move it. So that's one way to move your vertices. If you click on any of the handles, notice they're tied to the previous handle. Well, if you hold down Option before you click on the handle, you'll get the Convert Vertex tool, which will allow you to break the handle so you could actually get a custom break over the control vertex. So I'll just Command Z to undo that last piece. All right, let's deselect all of our layers and look at what we've got. As you can see, we have a custom shape we created with compound masks. That's 2 masks on 1 layer solid. And we have a neat wiggly line we created using the pen tool, creating a custom shape layer. So I hope you can see how flexible After Effects is between using compound masks and creating custom shapes with the pen tool. Now in this video, we're going to mask out the inside of this screen. And in the past, this used to make me a little nervous. But with the new Mask Feather tool, this is going to be relatively easy. So to get started, let's select our panel layer and go up to the pen tool. Instead of choosing the pen tool, click and hold, and I want you to look at the pen tool and the Mask Feather tool. Notice the key command G will toggle between these two. If you're used to using this command to toggle through all of the different tools, you probably want to go into the preferences and update it. But if you're new to After Effects, I would encourage you to leave this setting the way it is, because you'll see it's relatively helpful. With the pen tool selected, let's click in the corners of our screen. But first, we should scroll up to 100% magnification and make sure the resolution is full. This way we can see exactly what we're getting. Now I'm going to press the space bar and with my hand tool kind of center this up. Let's click through the corners of the inside of the screen. And I know this edge is a little hard to see, but that's okay. Just get them rough in there for now. You want to be on the inside of this dark edge and click up to our originating point to set the mask. In order to see this properly, we need to invert the mask. So select layer 1 in the timeline and press M. And we could either change this from add to subtract or just select inverted. Now, before we get too far into how to do this specific shot, I just want to give you a quick overview of the Mask Feather tool. So press G on your keyboard to bring it up and click on one of the edges. I'm going to click on this right edge and just hold and drag out. There we go. You can see I'm creating a feathered edge, and that's no different than what we used to be able to do. But check this out. If you click on an edge and drag back to the inside, you can really feather the daylights out of this thing. You can also click again and drag back out, and notice I have control as I'm clicking and dragging as to how quickly this variable edge is going to change as it comes around the corner. Now, in order to move these around with key commands, you can use your left and right arrows. If you hold down Shift, it'll move twice as fast. If you hold down Shift and click on the handles, you can select more than one handle as you move around. The up and down arrows will move you in and out away from the mask path. Just understand when you're using the left and right arrows, whether you're using Shift or not, left moves them counterclockwise and right moves them clockwise. We have a bunch of points. We need to delete these so we can actually mask our scene. So press Command A. Since we had one of these selected already, now they will all be selected and you can just press Delete. All right. Now since this edge is so dominant, I just want to feather this one edge. And in order to do that, hold down Shift and then hover over the edge and you'll see this icon pop up. Now when I click and drag, it's going to feather just this one edge. Now obviously way out here, that's a little drastic. So let's just feather it out maybe up to around there. That's looking good. I want to have a slightly soft edge all the way around, and I know this because when we deselect, see how sharp that is? That's not very realistic. So let's go over to the left edge after we select our mask again, and just click and drag a handle out just a little bit. And you notice something happened. Notice I have this hard edge here on this handle. That's because with these edges set the way they are, I have a sharp edge that I need to just drag around to here. See how this looks like a teardrop? Here, let me zoom in here so you can see it. See how this looks like a teardrop and then this handle is round? The teardrop handles are what are called hold handles. They harken back to hold keyframes. These are linear, just like linear keyframes. I want to just drag this close to my hold edge and then bring it in so it's relatively close to the edge of my mask. Now you can see if I hold the space bar and grab my hand tool and click and move around, I have a nice soft edge to the other part of this image. Now let's set back to 100 and deselect our layer so we can see what we're looking at. This is starting to look a lot more realistic. Honestly, if I were to keep tweaking this, I would grab my mask tool, press G again, and then start moving where these points are. So now that you understand how the mask feather tool works, you can use it in all kinds of new situations. So inevitably, you'll have a client that asks you, hey, can you put this piece of footage over a different background? And you'll go, sure, did you shoot it on green screen? And they'll look at you and go, what's green screen? At which point, you'll have to look at the footage and determine whether or not you can fix it with the roto brush before you tell them no. But in all seriousness, the roto brush actually can help save you in some of those situations. So for example, in this piece of footage right here, you can see we have this sunflower and we have this nice blurry background. Now this is a pretty good representation of a scene that you should be able to use the roto brush to isolate this sunflower from its background. So to do that, we need to get started using the roto brush. Before you load up the roto brush, you need to make sure that your fast preview options are set to off. The roto brush doesn't particularly like adaptive resolution, so let's change that to off. And now to load up the roto brush, you need to double click on your layer so you can open up the layer panel viewer. Now I'm just going to expand the viewer so we can see the entire piece of footage. Now the roto brush is this tool up here on the right-hand side of your tool palette in the upper left corner of the interface. It looks like a little guy with a paintbrush. Go ahead and click on that. If we scrub through our scene, you should notice, okay, the flower is dancing, that's great, but the exposure and the general shot never really changes. A lot of times, if your footage changes, you may want to start from a later point in the timeline to where the foreground and the background object are most different. But right now, since this isn't changing very much, we can go ahead and just start at the beginning of our project. Now that we're set at the beginning, what you want to do with the roto brush is click and draw inside the area that you want to keep. So notice I'm not drawing all the way out to the edges. Part of what the roto brush does is analyze the image and determine exactly how far out it wants to be in order to create that selection. So notice it did a pretty good job here. For this stem, I'm going to use a smaller brush. Now, a quick key command you can use for any painting in After Effects is to hold down the Command key and left click and drag up or down. So up, it makes it larger, down, it makes the brush smaller. On the PC, you want to use Control. Now, as I'm dragging down here, again, notice I'm not going all the way out to the edges. I'm just selecting the main portion of the image that we want to keep. For larger areas like this, again, I'm going to Command left drag and just drag up and draw. There we go. Okay, that one's looking pretty good. And I'll make this brush a little smaller for this side. And there we go. When I drew this, notice in this area down here, it accidentally drew too much of the information. The first thing I recommend doing when this happens is just pressing Command Z or Control Z to undo that last stroke. Sometimes you can just choose a smaller brush and then redraw the stroke to see if it interprets it properly the next time. Now, if it doesn't, just like this, you're okay. There's another way to refine this stroke. Now, if I hold down Option before I start drawing, notice my brush has changed into this red circle with a minus symbol. See, the green plus means I'm going to add to the stroke. When I hold Option or Alt on the PC, it means I'm going to subtract from the selection. So now I'm just going to draw outside the area of the leaf, making sure not to draw into the leaf. Okay, perfect. Now it's actually refined the edge of what we're doing. This looks pretty decent. You can refine the edge of this right here with the matte tool. So for example, if I wanted to smooth out the edges, I could just increase this number a little bit and wait for a second, and it will smooth this out. Now here, let's just crank this up quite a bit so you can see exactly what's happening here. See how the edges are kind of rounding out? So we don't want a smooth set to that high. Let's just set it to around 3 or 4. Now that'll smooth out my edges. If we press page down to move to the next frame, you can see it's doing a pretty good job of tracking what's happening in the scene. If I press page down again, it's still working. The way you want to work in the roto brush is to literally work frame by frame, just pushing page down and seeing how well it's tracing the object that you're trying to isolate. Now, I want you to look in the lower left corner of the layer viewer. See this yellow square? That's letting me know that's the first frame that I set up for my roto brush. And then this area with the pointing arrow kind of icons, that lets you know that anytime I make any changes to the right side of this yellow frame, those changes will propagate down the length of this preview area. As I'm pressing page down here, notice up here in the upper portion of the layer panel, I have this one area that is not getting cut out. Most of the time I would fix that outside of the roto brush, but I want to show you what happens if you refine the edges of a selection. So let's zoom in to 100%. I'm going to press the space bar and click and drag with my left mouse button to just grab the hand tool and move up in the scene. Let's make a very small brush. I'm just holding down Command and left clicking, and just click inside of here while holding down Option. And now we get a red icon, and we can just click and drag in this window. And notice now it's created a new selection. Now our preview area has continued to grow. As you make these cursory changes to the brush, that change for those extra areas. So if I just Command Z to undo that, notice you can see there's the shortened area. If I go back up under Edit and Redo, now it's going to propagate further down the timeline. Another tip with using the roto brush is to make sure that you use as little paint strokes as possible to make adjustments in your frame. Every time you draw a paint stroke and it's incorrect or you've made an adjustment, the roto brush will record that stroke. So that's why I've been very particular when I've made an incorrect stroke to press Command Z and undo. That will not save that stroke. So that way when I make my adjustment, that stroke will propagate throughout the length of this area. Here, let's switch our view back to fit up to 100%. The idea with the roto brush is to literally go frame by frame as you're painting and make adjustments using the Add to Selection option just by left-clicking and dragging with a green icon, or holding down Alt or Option to select less of an area. I'm just going to move to the end of my propagated region here, which is about 1 second, and I'll press N to end what we've done so far, because I think you understand the process. You could continue going down frame by frame and refining your mat or not refining your mat. Let's see the results of what we've done up to this point, which is only the first second. I want to load up a RAM preview, and in my preview panel, let's deselect from current time. That way the RAM preview will always load from the beginning of the comp. When you press 0 on your keyboard, notice now I'm going to get a preview of the rotobrush, and up here in the info window, it told me the rotobrush was propagating. Now notice that one corrective stroke is popping into the rotobrush selection at the specific frame where we first painted the rotobrush. Now I'm going to stop playback here for a second. As the rotobrush is moving, the edges of the mat are moving. So there is a way to refine the edges of the rotobrush, but we are going to jump into that in the next video. Now, if you're joining me from the previous video, you know we've cut out this flower from its background by using the rotobrush. So we're going to continue with that because creating the selection is only the first part of the process. Let's double-click Layer 1 to open up the Layer panel and reset our magnification to fit to 100. Now let's resize the interface to make the timeline a little smaller and give us a little bit better view of the scene we're working in. As you preview how the edges are working within the rotobrush, it's a good idea to actually set your magnification to 100%. Now, within the layer comp window, down in the middle, you can choose whether you just want to look at the boundary of the edge of the alpha channel that we're creating, or an overlay of the selections that we're making, or if you click and hold, you can go up to alpha, and it will show you the edges of the mat. Now, let's go ahead and load up a RAM preview so you can see the edges of the mat. Notice how the edges are kind of wiggling around. That's happening because of the movement of the flower. But that movement is actually called edge chatter. So if we stop playback here for a second, we can open our effects control panel. I'm just going to go up under Window and choose Effect Controls. And on the left-hand side here, we have a bunch of mat options. If we look at the mat options, you can see we can smooth the mat, which we went over in the last video, but I'll just show you here for a recap. If you crank it up, notice it makes the edges smoother. But that has a bad habit of actually giving you a really poor mat, so let me just undo that. That works well if you're trying to use the roto on something that's rather blurry. You can choke the mat just by bringing that number up or down. So obviously to the left actually does the opposite of choke, which gives it more room. So just understand that. Refine mat is what we want to look at. So select Refine mat, and the first option is Use Motion Blur. Go ahead and select that if your image has a lot of motion blur. And within the motion blur settings, you can adjust the samples up to give a smoother motion blur and or adjust the shutter angle to match the type of blur in the scene. If we close that, notice there's another option for Decontaminate Edge. If we expand the view of our effects controls by dragging out to the right, you'll notice this doesn't just decontaminate the edge, it decontaminates the edge colors. So let's go back to our layer comp window, and in the bottom, let's click on the pull down and change the alpha channel from alpha to RGB. This way we can see exactly what the edges of our image look like. If you press the space bar, we can grab the hand tool and click and drag. I want you to look at this leaf over here in the lower right corner of your comp. Notice how the edges are a little jagged. If you open up the decontamination options, we can't really increase the decontamination amount. If I decrease it, notice how this edge has kind of a halo around it. So we definitely want the decontamination amount up at 100. And if we select Extend Where Smothered, what this will do is just make an adjustment to the areas that you've actually started to adjust. Now, in order to select Extend Where Smothered, we need to increase the decontamination amount. If we move up to the right, notice now all these stray pixels on the right-hand side have disappeared. Let me reset that back to 0, and you can see how ragged that edge is. But if we actually increase this amount, it's going to deal with the colors and make things a little bit more smooth. Since we've increased our decontamination, if you select Extend Where Smothered, this will adjust how the edge actually works based on this increase setting as well as the Reduce Chatter setting. If both of these are set to 0, there's no reason to extend it because nothing has been smothered. View Contamination, if you select that, now you can see the amount of area that's been decontaminated along the edge of the mat. Now there's one last thing I want you to check out. So let's deselect that last selection, and let's actually hover our mouse over the layer comp window and press the tilde key. That's going to maximize this in our interface. In the lower right corner, there's this button called Freeze. And basically, once you've gone through and adjusted your rotobrush to the settings you like, you should freeze your rotobrush selections. What this actually does is allows After Effects to apply the rotobrush. So every time you load up a RAM preview and that kind of thing, it's not redoing the selection using the rotobrush. This, in essence, is freezing the selections you've made into a pre-rendered section. So once you're finished with the rotobrush, remember to freeze. And if you need to come back and make adjustments to your rotobrush, just understand you'll be prompted to unfreeze your rotobrush selections by selecting this button. So as you can see, the process for refining the edge of your rotobrush is just as important as actually developing the initial selection in the first place. Now that we have a firm foundation for understanding comps and layers, it's time to dive a little deeper into understanding how animation works. In this video, I've laid out multiple layers set up so we can actually drive home all the different kinds of keyframes that you can create and use within After Effects. So to get started, let's select layer 1 and 2 and press U to open up any of their animations. And this should look relatively familiar. We have some keyframes, and I know they're linear because they're diamond shaped. So load up a RAM preview and let's preview our animation. As you can see here, it's a pretty straightforward linear animation. Now I'm going to stop playback by pressing the spacebar and click up here in my timeline. I want you to click right around 4 seconds. The reason I want to do this is to set the work area. So press N on your keyboard to set the work area. What this is going to do is load up only this first 4 seconds into RAM when we do RAM previews, since all of the keyframes are set within the first 4 seconds. So let's move forward and jump into what Bezier keyframes are. So turn off the visibility for layers 1 and 2, turn on the visibility for 3 and 4, and you guessed it, select layers 3 and 4 by clicking on one and shift-clicking on the next, and press the U key again to open up these position keyframes. I purposefully have left these as linear because I want to show you how to actually change between all these different kinds of keyframes. So to change these from linear to Bezier, I'm going to click and drag a lasso around all those keyframes. Even though they're on multiple layers, it's okay. Once all the keyframes are selected, I can just right-click on any one of the keyframes and go down to the menu and choose Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease to change this from linear to Bezier. Now with all the different keyframes set to Bezier, let's load up a RAM preview. Again, I'm just pressing 0 on my keypad to give you a RAM preview. And as you can see here, the words slide in a much more natural motion. Now, let's turn off the visibility of Bezier and check out what roving keyframes do. So click and shift-click layers 5 and 6, turn on their visibility, and press the U key. Now in here, we have 4 different linear keyframes. And I added these extra keyframes to kind of show you some of the different things that happen when you have multiple keyframes. First thing, you know these lines on the canvas represent motion paths or the animation path. These are the paths that these words are going to be traveling. And the dots in between the path represent the speed at which these words are going to be moving. So the closer they are together, the slower they're moving, and the further apart, the faster they're moving. Roving keyframes are interesting because they'll smooth all this motion out. And they do so by actually moving the position of the middle keyframes. So to show you what I'm talking about, let's preview this animation first. press 0 on your keypad to load up a RAM preview. And you can see as the words bounce from keyframe to keyframe, they're actually changing velocity. Now let's press the spacebar to stop playback and draw a lasso around all of these keys. Again, right-click on any of them, and this time, to activate roving keyframes, you just want to click Rove Across Time. Now you notice the first and last keyframes are still linear, but these other keyframes in between have shifted in the timeline. They're doing this because they actually move where the keyframes live to smooth out the motion. So the words will definitely still pass through each one of those points. I'm just clicking and dragging to kind of scrub through the animation. They still pass through the points, but you notice now all of the points have the same exact spacing. So if we load up a RAM preview, you can see with roving keyframes, it's going to move at the same velocity all the way through the animation. Now let me stop playback here for 1 second. One other thing about roving keyframes, if we click anywhere in the gray area in the timeline to deselect all the keyframes, with roving keyframes, if you click on either the first or the last keyframe, as you drag them out, notice the spacing of the middle keyframes will change. And even if I try and click on one of these and move it, look what happens. It changes from a roving keyframe back to a linear keyframe, because linear keyframes inhabit a specific point in time. Let's just Command Z to undo that last thing. Roving keyframes will rove based on where the first and last keyframes are in your timeline. Let's go to hold keyframes. These happen to be one of my favorites. Let's turn off the visibility of layers 5 and 6 and select 7, 8, turn on their visibility and press U. I'm just scrolling down with my mouse so I can see these layers. Now again, we have linear keyframes. Just draw the lasso around and then right-click, and instead of them being linear keyframes, we can choose Toggle Hold Keyframe. When we do that, notice these look kind of like a home plate. And basically that's because they're holding the previous keyframe's value right up until the next keyframe. So notice there are no little dots along our animation path. That's because it's not going to be moving. So press 0 to load up a RAM preview, and you can see now with hold keyframes, they hold the previous value until the next keyframe. So now that you've seen some of the different kind of cool keyframes we can create inside of After Effects, let's get started with our animations. It's keyframe animation that's really at the core of about 90% of the After Effects projects I've ever worked on. And in case you need the definition again, keyframes are just recordings of the settings of one specific parameter at a specific point in time. And there are actually several ways to create keyframes inside of After Effects. So let's look at our project here. You notice if you double-click the keyframes comp just to make sure everything's open, we have the Kinetico logo, and all the layers are set up in our comp already. We have pre-comps for each one of the words, and we also have individual layers for each one of the objects. Now these happen to be Illustrator files, and everything's pretty much already set up for animation. So all we're going to do is animate how these little circles appear into the screen, and then we'll fade the words on one after the other. So this is going to be the final resting place of everything in this animation. Now to get started, let's select layer 4, the yellow circle layer, and we'll adjust the position keyframes to begin the animation process. So press P on your keyboard. This just optimizes our timeline so we're only looking at the position parameter. Now, with position open, we'll animate backwards. I can go to 1 second here on the timeline and record my first keyframe. To record the keyframe, go to the position parameter and click on the stopwatch. See, I'm saying backwards because we're starting at the end. Notice I'm at 1 second. That's going to be where our animation ends for this one specific object. If we move our current time indicator back to the beginning, 0 frames, now we can go ahead and move this off the screen. So to see things better, let's go ahead and expand our canvas here just a little bit so I can move this all the way off the screen. And just so I can see layer 4, I'll hover my mouse over the timeline and scroll up until I see layer 4. Now, since layer 4 is already selected, I can click and drag it up. After I start dragging, I'm going to hold down Shift, and that'll snap the movement along the Y-axis. drag it up until it goes all the way off the edge of the canvas. Now you'll notice we have 2 keyframes and we have an animation. Let's go ahead and press 0 on our keypad, and as you can see, the first circle is animated. Now I'm going to stop playback just by pressing the spacebar. And instead of having to recreate all of the keyframe animations for each one of these circles, what I want to do is copy and paste these keyframes onto the other objects. Let's see what happens if I select the position keyframes for this first yellow circle. To select all the keyframes quickly, just click on the word position in the timeline, and now you'll notice both of these keyframes are highlighted bright yellow. If we scroll down to our blue circle here, press Command V, or just go up and say Edit, Paste, notice nothing's happening. So let's select our position keyframe and press Command C to copy, or Edit, Copy. If we go down to the blue layer, we can go to Edit and Paste. Now, when we press P on the blue layer, look, our keyframes are pasted all the way down here on the timeline. Well, that's a problem. And also notice now this circle's gone. Well, that's a problem too. So let's start with the obvious. The first one, this down the timeline, not so much. We don't want to do that. And basically what you need to do is not have your current time indicator down the timeline when you paste. See, whenever you paste keyframes, they'll paste exactly where the current time indicator is. So let's just Command Z, undo that last command. Now the other problem, see this position keyframe, it's actually not only recording the position of this object on the y-axis, but it also recorded it on the x-axis. So what we need to do is just copy the y-axis of these position keyframes. I'm going to expand this view up here a little bit, and to do this, select the position parameter and right-click. Now, if you go to Separate Dimensions, you'll notice I have keyframes for X position and Y position. Now, since the Y position already matches for all these other layers, all we have to do is select the Y position keyframes just by clicking on it and say Command C or Control C on Windows. And I'm going to press Home to make sure that I've moved back to the beginning of the timeline. And now, if we press Command V, you notice it automatically split the position keyframes and applied that set of keyframes to that new parameter. So we can do the exact same thing for green here. So let's press Home, and I'm going to say Command V, and now that's going to move down. Now, if I want to move these so they kind of fall one after the other, all we have to do is just slide the keyframes in the timeline. So I'll just expand my timeline view here just a little bit and select the Y position keyframes for layer 2. Instead of just selecting the Y position keyframes, go ahead and select layer 5 and just click and drag that layer to start further down the timeline. See, since the object's starting off the canvas already, I'm just scrolling out with my mouse, nobody's going to know whether it existed before this point in time or not. So let's do the same thing with the green layer. I'm going to press U to open up its animated parameters, and that shows me just the Y position keyframes, which I pasted, and I'll just drag down the timeline here. If we press 0, you can see 1, 2, 3. Now we're going to start speeding things up. You already know how to break out keyframes and copy them and paste them. Let me show you how to actually animate multiple objects at once. It's pretty straightforward. Let's select layers 7 through 9. Click on the first layer, layer 7, and hold down Shift and click on 9. Now we can go ahead and press P to open up the position parameter. There's a pretty neat shortcut you can use to automatically create keyframes for specific parameters at any time. And basically the way that works, instead of just pressing P to open up the position, what you want to do is position your current time indicator where you want to set your first keyframe. I want the motion of these objects to end at 1 second. So I'm going to move my current time indicator to 1 second. And now I'm going to press Option P. And what that does, holding down Option or Alt on Windows, it sets the keyframe for whatever parameter you hit the shortcut for next. So P is the shortcut for position. If you press Home In order to move all these down, all you have to do is click and drag on the Y parameter. And I'm going to click and drag to the right until they go all the way off screen. Notice, since I had all 3 layers selected, when I clicked and dragged on one Y parameter, it moved all of them. So to ripple this down, all we have to do is just click and drag on the layer, click and drag on the layer. So now if we press 0, you see they all pop down. And now all we need to do is add the fade for each of the words. So to do that, we can just select our first word, which is connect, and move our playhead to where we want our first keyframe. Here, let's go ahead and set it right at the end of this animation. So right about 2 seconds, 5 frames. And we can press Option T. That'll set a keyframe. Now, I want to change this parameter because I don't want it to start at 100%. So I'll change it down to 0. Now we have our keyframe set. And let's have this fade up over 1 second. So to move down 1 second in the timeline, I'm just going to click on the number here in the timeline and press +100. That's going to move down 1 second. And now to have this fade up, to set the second keyframe, just click and drag on the value well for opacity. So I'm going to click and drag it to the right and set it to 100. Now to apply these keyframes to the subsequent layers, all we have to do is select both opacity keyframes. I'm going to do that in the timeline just by clicking and drawing with a lasso here. And since I want to stagger how these fade in, I'm going to move my current time indicator to about halfway in between and select Eco and press. Actually, I need to copy those. So with our current time indicator moved, that's fine. Just go ahead and draw a lasso over both the keyframes and press Command or Control C to copy. Now we can select layer 1 and Command or Control V to paste. And again, if I press U, that'll open up the animated parameter for that layer. And let's do the same thing for ink here. Let's move down the timeline with our current time indicator and press Command or Control V. And again, with U, you can see how that's set up. So let's preview our entire animation. Press Home on your keyboard. I'm going to deselect all the layers here and change my magnification to fit up to 100 and just kind of give a little bit more room here and press 0 on my keyboard. So as you can see, we've now created our first keyframe animation of the entire logo animation. We know how to create and edit keyframes, but where the good animators end and the great animators begin is really determined between the keyframes. That's known as keyframe interpolation. You Flash folks might know this as tweening. It's adjusting the changes between the keyframes. Now, there are 2 kinds of interpolation to adjust in After Effects: temporal interpolation and spatial interpolation. The easiest way to think of this is temporal means time. So changes over time like opacity or scale. Spatial interpolation means changes over space, like position. So let's go ahead and press 0 and look at a RAM preview of our animation. I'm just going to press the spacebar and stop here for a second. You can see we have our logo animating into the scene. And if you're joining me from the previous video, you might recognize this but think, hey, these first 2 layers look different. And they do. I just went ahead and trimmed the start point. If I select layer 3 and press T to open up its opacity, you notice I trimmed the layer to start at the first keyframe. I'm going to press J and move forward so you can see this first keyframe is set to a value of 0. So before this keyframe, the opacity was always 0. So there's no reason to have this extra layer here at the start. So I just trimmed the start point. This is a good habit to get into if you want to optimize your render times. Now, move the current time indicator back to the beginning of the timeline, and let's select, let's say, this yellow layer, layer 4. Press U to open up any of its animated parameters, and let's scrub in the timeline and see what we're looking at. You can see we've got some different things moving on here, but I just want to focus on the animation of this yellow ball. So with the yellow layer selected, I'm going to go ahead and solo that layer just by clicking this box right here in the timeline. All these other layers haven't disappeared, but this is just allowing me to focus on this one layer and not be distracted. Just so we can see things a little better, I'm going to zoom in just by using the scroll wheel on my mouse. and press the space bar to move down so I can kind of center this up in the scene here. As I scrub through, you can see exactly what's going on here. Now with these keyframes, I want to point out something. Notice the opacity keyframes here look like diamonds, and these keyframes here don't. That's because these have a different interpolation. Now to see what interpolation is applied to a keyframe, go ahead and select the keyframe by clicking on it, and you can right-click and go to Keyframe Interpolation. And here, under Temporal, notice we have Continuous Bezier. See, I'm going to cancel this for a second. In the previous video, we broke out the position data into both X and Y position. Now when we did that, by default, what After Effects did is change the interpolation from linear to that Bezier setting. So what we want to do, since we're going to be making changes in general, what I like to do is start with linear keyframes. So I'm going to click and drag a lasso around all these keyframes and right-click on one of them and choose Keyframe Interpolation and just change the temporal to linear. Now when I click OK, you can see these are set to linear keyframes. To see how linear keyframes are represented graphically, what I want to do is move my playhead back to the beginning of the timeline, and let's click on the graph editor here at the top in the center of your timeline. It looks kind of like an XY graph. If you click on that, you notice I have two parameters, X position and Y position. Notice they're color-coded. Here's the X and here's the Y. Now the graph is set up in an interesting fashion because this is the speed graph. If I hover my mouse over the green line here, you can see it's moving to be exactly at 370 pixels a second. Down here on the X, it's moving at 0 pixels a second. Now the way this graph works, if I click only on, let's say, opacity, it'll show me the changes in the opacity in terms of its velocity. If I click only on X, it's only going to show me X. If I click only on Y, it's only going to show me Y. Since the X position never really changed, it's set to a value of 0 over the entire time because the object's only moving on Y, we don't need those keyframes anymore. So I'm going to get out of the graph editor and just draw a lasso around the X position keyframes and press delete. Now we can focus just very closely on what's happening on the Y parameter. If I zoom in a little more closely here, notice how these dots are evenly spaced in my graph. This is because it's a linear velocity, and if we open our graph editor here, you can see with the Y position selected, it goes from 370 pixels a second and stops in one frame down to 0 pixels a second. What we want to do is ease the speed of this. And the way to do that, we'll get out of the graph editor and start with the first keyframe here. I want this to kind of speed up like you would in a car at a stoplight. When you stop and the light turns green, you accelerate from 0 gradually. So to do that, select the first keyframe, go up under Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and choose Easy Ease Out. I know that doesn't make sense because it's the first keyframe, but you're easing out of its current state into a new velocity. So now if you look, it's kind of hard to see, but the dots are a little closer together at the top, and then as you move down, they get further and further apart. Notice here at the bottom, they stay far apart and just stop. So let's draw a lasso around the second keyframe, and instead of going back up to animation, this time you can just right-click on the keyframe and go to Keyframe Assistant, choose Easy Ease In. We want to ease it back into its current state. So when I say Easy Ease In, okay, there you go. Now you can see how close these two little dots are. And now if you look up here, these two are much further apart. So this is actually going to ease the motion. If we press 0, you can see it slowly came to a stop. Let me zoom out here so you can see this. We'll fit back to 100, and let's check out the animation again. There we go. It's a lot more natural motion. Now let's select the blue layer here and press U to open up its keyframes. I want to open the graph editor one more time. If we select the Y position keyframes here, notice how the velocity starts at 0, eases up to a high velocity of around 550, and then eases right back down again. See, if I select the Y position keyframes here that had those funky eases on them, notice the velocity is very strange in how it moves. That's one of the reasons why I like to actually start by changing these keyframes back to a linear interpolation. That way, when you look at it in the graph editor, you can see exactly what's happening here. If I want to make these adjustments, I can just right-click directly on the keyframe and make sure my first ease is out and my second ease is back in. Now, if I select the Y position of the blue layer and look in the graph editor, you can see I've got the ease there as well. I want to encourage you to keep going through the rest of the animation and easing your keyframes. That way, when you're finished, you can see just how more natural the motion of your keyframes are going to be when you pay attention to your keyframe interpolation. So let's check out this animation. Just load it up in your RAM preview. And you can see it works, but honestly, it's not that exciting. The word is kinetico, so let's actually make it have a little more energy. There are two reasons why this is kind of meh, and the first one is the fact that these are moving rather slowly. And the second one, the fade in the words, it's just not that energetic. So let's go ahead and delete the fade off these words by selecting the top 3 layers and pressing T. And make sure your current time indicator is past the rightmost keyframe, so they're all set to 100% opacity. And just click any of the stopwatches, and that'll delete all the keyframes. Now let's deal with the speed of these circles. So select layer 4 and shift-click to layer 9. Press U to open up all the animated parameters, and sure enough, we have our keyframes. What we want to do is speed up everything. So let's select the rightmost keyframe for all of the different layers. When I clicked on that, I noticed I had accidentally moved the selected keyframes. So I just undid that for a second. And now I'm just shift-clicking on all the other layers. Now, as we drag these back to the left, you'll notice we can scroll and you can see that, like in this second part of the animation, these circles aren't quite lining up. I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit, and you can see they aren't lining up when they should resolve. So what we need to do is actually adjust when these keyframes are so that they're actually happening on the same frame. So I'm just going to park my current time indicator on the rightmost keyframe of this blue layer and make sure the right keyframe in this half brown layer is in the same position. That way, when we scrub through, you can see it's actually going to resolve at the exact same time. You can do that for the rest of these layers, but let's move on and adjust the energy of these words. And let's press spacebar to grab the hand tool and just sort of reposition. They're just kind of popping into the scene, and I'm just going to zoom back out here in the canvas. Now, as we scrub through, you can see the words just kind of pop onto the scene. What I want to do is have the words scale into place. So it looks like they're zooming from infinity far away right up to where they are right now. So to do that, let's press S to adjust the scale. I could do this with a position keyframe if we move this into a 3D layer, but I don't want to do that just yet. Scale is going to work perfectly fine for this. So let's keyframe backwards again. Instead of starting at the very beginning of our layer, press I to make sure our time indicator is at the end point of the layer, and move down 10 frames. So just going to plus 10 there, and click the stopwatch next to the scale. Now if we press I to move back to the beginning, we can change our scale parameter back to 0, and we have 2 keyframes set. So if we load up a RAM preview here, you can see it comes in, and it's pretty cool, but you notice it's moving at a constant velocity. I know that for 2 reasons. First reason, I can see it, but sometimes you won't always be able to see it. But the second reason, these diamonds are telling me it's actually linear. So to see, let's open up the graph editor. You can come up to the graph editor button or press Shift F3. As you can see, my scale parameter is moving at a constant velocity, and then it just stops. In the graph editor, in the lower left corner, I have this one button that looks sort of like a chart of some sort. If you click on it here, we could change between the speed graph or the value graph. Let's go to the value graph. And in here, notice now I can see it's going from 0% scale to 100% scale. And to adjust this horizontally, I'm just going to click and drag here on my zoom slider. And you can see now I've got a nice linear move to this. In the previous video, I showed you how you could use ease to smooth out animations. So let's select this first keyframe just by drawing a lasso around it. And if you look here on the bottom of the keyframe editor, on the right-hand side, you can adjust the different keyframes. So this button in the lower right corner of the keyframe editor will actually create an ease out. Now, if we select our right keyframe, we can click the other button to ease back in. If we preview this, I'm just going to move my current time indicator forward and load up a preview here. You can see I have a smooth motion to this, but even that is a little kind of boring. So let's change our play range just so we can kind of loop that one section. Move your current time indicator back up in front of the firstmost keyframe and press B. That'll begin our playback range, and then move your current time indicator to around 3 seconds and press N. Now when I load up a preview, it's just going to cycle this one area. It's kind of interesting. Notice, since I'm editing the value graph, if I click and drag here, I can adjust the handles for how this actually will scale up. And notice if I drag up, what's going to happen to the word, the value of the scale of the word will actually end up over 100%. Sometimes this is actually really good to do because it's going to give a little pop to the word. So just load it up in your RAM preview. You can see it's a little more fun now. It just sort of pops up and pops in. I'll stop playback, and I want to accentuate how quickly that ramps up before it makes that change. And we can do that by just clicking this left keyframe handle and dragging it to the right. Now what that's going to do is it slows how quickly it moves out, and then it'll exponentially get faster and faster as you move up the line. If you really want to accentuate it more, you can drag up a little more, and you notice now we're going to go way large. I don't know if that'll work, but let's check it out. There we go. So as you can see, when you use the graph editor, you can always make things a lot more interesting. Personally, I like to think of the graph editor as the place to go when it comes time to really polish the movement of an animation. Because after all, setting the initial keyframes really only tells you what's happening on those specific frames. It's between the keyframes where you end up getting the entire story. Now, if you're joining me from the last video, you know we went ahead and made adjustments in the keyframe editor to the scale parameter. In this video, we're going to make adjustments to the position parameter for the word eco. So if you just look at a RAM preview here, you can see we have Kinet pop up and then eco just sort of appears. So I want to have eco move in a similar fashion to the scale effect that we did, but we'll do it using position, and we'll actually convert this layer to a 3D layer just by clicking this box. And now you notice when I press P to open up my position data, I have a parameter for Z. So it's X, Y, and Z. We'll work backwards just like we did with scale by just moving our playhead a little bit down the timeline here and marking a position keyframe. Let's expand the work area duration just a little bit by dragging to the right and press I to move to the beginning of the layer. Now to see which way this is actually going to move, let's click and drag on the Z parameter. And yes, we want to make an adjustment all the way back by clicking and dragging to the right. Let's actually have this disappear down to around 5,000. There's a slight issue with this, and that's the fact that the anchor point is off to the left-hand side, but I actually kind of like that this is going behind the word Kinet, and really if I want it behind, I can just drag it underneath Kinet because Kinet is still a 2D layer. So it's just going to sit right on top of eco, thinking that it's actually behind it. And it's going to give us the visual trick that it looks like it's actually peeking out from behind the word. We have our first two keyframes. Let's preview this animation. Okay, that's starting to look pretty cool, but I want echo to kind of bounce out there a little bit. So let's add a third keyframe. I'm going to move my playhead out to the right here, just a few frames past where it was before. And I want this keyframe to be exactly the same as the previous one. And to do that, we'll use this keyframe button here on the left-hand side of the timeline. That added another keyframe, so if we press J, we can move back to our middle keyframe, and let's drag to the left just so it pops out a little bit. So if we scrub through, you can see it's going to pop out and then land. Let's load up a RAM preview again. And that looks pretty cool. I want you to select all the position keyframes by clicking on the word position and open the keyframe editor. Now in here, you'll notice I only have changes along the Z axis. So if we scrub through, you can see I've got kind of a sharp change that's happening here. And that's happening because if we look at our keyframes, these are linear keyframes. So to smooth this out, let's click on this. And instead of clicking ease down here in the lower right, just right click on it. In here, we could choose keyframe assistant, easy ease. Now, when we choose easy ease, it looks like nothing's really happened here. And something has, if you notice the velocity down here is going to kind of smooth out. But if you want to see things a little more closely, what you need to do is zoom in. See, if I click on this to the right, it's going to zoom in. And here, if I scroll up in the timeline here, you can see it's kind of made this a little bit larger in the scene so I can sort of see what's going on. And let's just press the space bar to grab the hand tool and just sort of move our canvas over so we can sort of see what's going on here in our viewer. I want to try and draw handles out from this parameter. And if you hold down Option, it looks like you can click on this and drag out, but you notice nothing's happening here. And that's because these are position keyframes and they actually have all three parameters, X, Y, and Z active. In order to actually control the value of an individual parameter with handles, you need to break it out into its own separate value. And the way you do that from within the graph editor is to click this button here in the bottom. Now, when I click on that, notice if I click and drag directly on the keyframe, it just kind of snaps and moves around. That's not what I want to do. Okay, so let's undo that, Command Z. And now you want to hover over the point and press Alt or Option and click and drag. And now this is going to give you the ability to draw some handles out over this keyframe. Now, one of the things that's interesting about dealing with this is notice I can change how long the handle is or how smooth this change is on one side, but not really match it on the other. If I click back on this side, notice even though they're working in tandem, I still have to kind of adjust if I want the lengths to change. If I wanted this to kind of break apart, here, let's scrub down here so you can see what's happening. It's going down, back across. If I wanted there to be like a sudden change, I could hold down Alt or Option again, but when you click on the handle, it'll actually allow you to make a change independent of the other side. This way, now when it comes up, it's just going to stop rather abruptly and then kind of bounce out. Well, here, let's preview that and you can see. It's kind of okay. It's not exactly what I was looking for, so I'll just drag this handle back down here again. If I hold down Option and click on the handle again, it sort of snaps it back so we're making adjustments like we did before. So now let's preview this animation. And that's pretty cool. That really gives it kind of an organic, sort of realistic bounce. Notice it kind of bounces past and then down again and then sort of wiggles almost like it's in Jello. See, this is kind of one of the things that you want to do when you want your animations to kind of really step up a level. You want to accentuate or over-accentuate the specific moves that they're creating. And a lot of times I find the fastest, easiest way of doing that is by making those changes in the keyframe editor. Now, in this video, we're going to dive into some pretty advanced animation techniques. So if you just kind of stick with me, we're going to get through some really cool things really quickly, and hopefully you'll learn not only a little bit about parenting, the pick whip, and null objects, but you'll also learn a little bit how to troubleshoot, because a lot of times when you're designing, things won't work exactly how you're expecting them to. So you need to be able to have a plan B. So let's get started. Load up a RAM preview of the animation and let's check it out. As you can see, I've got this kind of cool, funky logo animation, but there are still some things that we could do to kind of take it over the top. Now, just stop playback there, and I want to talk about where we're headed. So first thing, I like these circles, and I think right now they're not getting the respect they deserve because they're too small and off to the left when the animation starts. And I really love when these words come in, but I feel like the fact that they're bouncing and coming in, they're not really that connected to these circles. So I want to add some animation. We're going to make the movement of this word drive the color of these circles. And lastly, we can just let the rest of it sort of play out because it looks really nice in terms of its design and how it's positioned. So to zoom in on all these circles, let's look at what's going on with these layers. Select layer 4 and shift-click through layer 9 and press the U key to open up any animated parameters. And as you can see, we've got a lot of position keyframes. So if I wanted to try and reposition these, if I just clicked and dragged, you notice, well, now I've just added many, many more keyframes. That's not what we want to do. You should create a null object. Anytime you're trying to create many objects and reposition them, but they already have animation applied to them, try a null object. So select layer 1, go up under layer and choose new null object. Even though it looks like this is visible on the screen, and even though you can click on it and move it around, let me just undo the position change there. Rest assured, when you go to render your animation, the null object will not render in your scene. Let's go ahead and press P for the null object and select all of the other layers in our animation. So I'm going to click on the first comp there and shift click all the way through the layer 10. Now with all the layers selected, we want to change the parent property. Now there are two ways to parent one layer to another layer. One is by using the pick whip, which is right here. If we click on the pick whip for one of the layers and drag it up to the null, it will choose that null object. I'll just Command Z to undo that. Another way is by clicking on the pull down and choosing the layer, and notice it populates for all of them. If you didn't see this parent column, right-click next to layer name and go to columns and choose parent. Make sure it's active. I'm not going to choose that right now because that'll in turn hide it since it's already active. So now that all the layers are the child of layer 1, go ahead and click and move the null object around the scene. Since I'm focusing right on these circles, I could have positioned the null right in the middle of the circles before I made my adjustment, but I really don't have to worry about that. That's because I'm going to use some scrubbing and some basic timeline adjustment techniques to fix this. So first things first, let's undo where we moved our logo because we do want it to resolve here. So let's choose when we want it to resolve to that position. And I want it to be in that position just before the word connect pops up. So let's position our playhead to around 204 and add our first position keyframe for the null object. Let's move our current time indicator forwards, and right about here at 116, let's add a second keyframe. I'm just going to click this diamond here on the left to add the keyframe. I've set my position keyframes. Let's go ahead and move the position just by clicking and dragging on the x-axis. And here I can click and drag on the y-axis down a little bit. Okay, now that's nice and center, but I want to add some scale. So I'm going to hold Shift and press S. So position doesn't go away, but I can access the scale parameter. Let's press K to move to the second keyframe and add our first scale parameter, because I want it to scale to this 100%. Let's press J and scale this way, way, way up. Now notice when I scaled this up, I'm going to have to reposition things. And that's the case for why you would want to actually position the null object before you made the change. But again, part of this video, I want you to learn how to just sort of roll with adjustments. So as you can see here, I've got my animation up tight, and then it zooms back to reveal our text. If we move our current time indicator up here, you'll notice the edges of this look kind of blurry. And that's because these are vector objects, but they are scaled up to 351%. But the vector objects were not actually activated to be vector. So what you need to do is select all of these Illustrator layers just by clicking on one and shift-clicking on the other, and click on the continuously rasterize button, which is this one that looks sort of like the sun. You want to activate it for all of those layers just by clicking in the box below. Now we have nice, crisp, sharp lines. May appear a little jagged, but that's just because we're viewing it at 50%. See, if I looked at it at 100, you can see beautiful sharp lines. Let's change magnification back to 50. You can see I have my position and scale keyframes, and this movement is going to be rather linear. Not quite what I'm looking for. So let's just add eases to both of these keyframes. Just click and drag and choose Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease In. I'm going to click and drag a lasso around the other keyframes, right-click on them, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease Out. Now that's going to give that smooth motion back, but also I want to go ahead and animate the colors of these objects. The way we'll do this, we'll have the scale of the word connect actually drive the color change of each one of these little circles. The circle I want to change for this specific example will be this green circle here. In order to change the hue, I want to apply a hue saturation effect adjustment. So go up to Effects, Color Correction, and choose Color Balance HLS. That gives me the hue, lightness, and saturation adjustments. In order to have this effect get driven by the scale, I need to actually select what parameter I want to change as the scale of this object changes. So select the hue parameter here, and we need to actually zoom in on our timeline. So let's make our timeline a little larger, and I'll scroll up till I can get to the word connect. I'll select layer 2 and press S to open up the scale parameter, and go back down and reselect my hue. The reason you want the word hue selected is you have to have the specific parameter highlighted when you go up under Animation and choose Add Expression. Now with this expression set up to be applied, it's actually pink and waiting for me to click on the pick whip and tell it what parameter is going to adjust the change in the hue. Now look what happens when I click on this pick whip and drag it up to the word scale. Notice nothing happens until I press Enter on my keyboard. And notice what happened when I pressed Enter, it said, okay, well the scale's 100, and so your hue change needs to be 100. Well, that's a problem because this is a logo, and we know when the scale is finished animating, I want it to have the correct color. So what we need to do is move back to the last scale keyframe and look at the parameter. It's set at 100. So to edit this expression, I can just click on the type and click one more time to make sure that the cursor is active all the way on the right side of the words. And I'm going to type -100 at the end. What this will do is offset that animation. So now when this is at 100, this will be set to -100. So now when the circles animate in, they'll be the wrong colors, but that's okay because when the word connect comes in, it will resolve to the proper color. I encourage you to try and do the same thing for all of the following circles. Just remember, you need to go up under Effects and apply a color balance effect before you can select the specific parameter and add the chosen expression. So we covered a lot of things right now, but if you made it through this far, I want you to feel happy and encouraged because these were some pretty advanced topics. Also, relax, take a breath, because throughout the rest of this course, we're definitely going to be using null objects, parenting, and expressions to further drive your creative animations. When you create animations with position keyframes, when you have the layer selected, you may notice this line that pops up in your viewer. This line is letting you know that there is spatial data and position keyframes set on your canvas. Even though it's a visual representation of what's going on, it's also another way to control your animations. So let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. If we scrub back through here, you notice, okay, well, I've got a box here and I've got these dots moving along. And here, I'll just move up a second. And you can see I have a second box there. Each one of these is actually one of the keyframes. You can click directly on the boxes and move them around, and notice down here, my position data is changing because I'm actually moving that keyframe. Let me just undo that last move. You also have Bezier handles on these lines as well, and they're kind of hard to see. So what I'm going to do is actually create a curvy animation here, and then I'll show you the handles. So if I want this object to start up here and then kind of curve out here and then come back down, it might make sense to move your playhead kind of in the middle where you'd want the new keyframe to be set and just move the shape. See, when I do that, now I can more clearly see the Bezier handles. So if you just click and drag, notice now I'm changing the motion path of this object. If we preview this, you'll notice it's not the smoothest animation. Let me just stop playback there. Since you have these Bezier handles, as a general rule, whenever you're trying to create a path that kind of has curves, you want to do it with as few keyframes as possible. It's just going to make things move that much more smoothly. So let's actually select this middle keyframe and press delete. Now, if I click directly on one of the keyframes, I can adjust the Bezier handles, and notice I can still get kind of a nice S-curve just by adjusting the motion path. If we add ease on the beginning and the end of these, you can accentuate the motion and the velocity, making the little dots along the line here change in their space. But for now, let's check this animation out. So as you can see, it's much more smooth. But I know you're thinking to yourself, well, what if I want to actually have, I don't know, a complex path? Like, what if I want this to move in a perfect circle? Well, I'm not going to sit there and try and frame out each individual section of the animation and make a perfect circle. That would take forever. But what you can do is actually use any masks or any paths, like straight out of Illustrator or Photoshop, or even here on my background gradient. If I press M, I can open up my masks, and here you can see I have a mask path that I've already drawn. I drew it with the ellipse tool up here. This mask isn't doing anything because it's set to do nothing at the none setting. So what I can do is actually select this mask path if I want, let's say, this object to move on this circle. So when I select it, I can go up under Edit and choose Copy. And now let's select the blue shape, and instead of having it travel along this path, let's delete those position keyframes. And I'll move my current time indicator to the beginning of the timeline and press Command V, which is paste. Now, since I had position selected, it automatically placed that animation as position keyframes. And you notice it created several keyframes. And notice I have a linear keyframe here and a linear keyframe here. If I just click on one of them, I can stretch out the keyframes because these ones in between here are roving keyframes. And if you need a refresher on all the different kinds of keyframes, definitely go back and watch the first video in this chapter. But as you can see, when you paste animation paths, you can actually create custom animations relatively quickly. Now there's one last tip I want to give you when you're pasting animation paths. Instead of pasting it directly to the object, you might want to try pasting to a null object. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's delete these position keyframes for this blue shape. I'm going to go up under Layer and choose New Null Object. Now open the position data for this null object by pressing P, and then select the position and press Command or Control V to paste those keyframes. Now the null object is going to travel along this path. What this does, it allows me to take this blue object and make it the child of the null. So select the blue layer and grab your pick whip under the parent section. If you don't see parent in your timeline, right-click up in this gray bar area and go to columns and make sure it's active. I'm going to click on the pick whip and point it up to null 2. Notice the null is going to move, but now also my shape is moving. What this is going to allow me to do, I can move my current time indicator to, let's say, the left side of the circle. And now I can actually start offsetting the motion of this animation. So, for example, if I wanted this to drift to the left, I could just click and drag on the X parameter to the left and set my first keyframe. Now, if we rewind back to the top, it's kind of offset, so I just want to set that back to 0. So now, as it travels along the path, it's going to kind of spin out sideways. So we could go around and continue adding that to the other parts of the path, but what I want to do is just deselect the layer and preview our animation. So as you can see, it's drifting off the path. If you want to see it a little bit better, go ahead and select your position keyframes. That way, when you scrub through the timeline here, you can see how it's drifting off the path. Now, I definitely encourage you to keep going through this and making adjustments to your blue shape, just so you can kind of get a better grasp on how much extra control you can get by using custom animation paths and parenting with a null object. So in this video, we're going to learn how to preview audio and add some markers to our scene so we can time things out for animation later. Now, even though our scene looks rather busy, this will make sense once we actually start editing the appearance of these objects to the beat of the music. Now, since this is a rather jumbled scene, I'm just going to turn the visibility of all these layers off, except for the background layer. Now, since I do want to control the appearance of these layers as they move throughout the scene, I just want to have a general count so I can know how many markers I want to add to my music. So if we count from layer 1, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 is the background layer. So 6 elements, obviously if you look at the number of the layers, that would tell you the same thing as well. Now, select our layer 8. The way you preview audio in After Effects is by using the period key on your keypad. Now, when you hit the period key on your keypad, music will play back in real time, and then you can add markers in real time by pressing the asterisk key on your keypad. Now, the corresponding keystrokes, if you're on a keyboard that doesn't have a keypad, it's Control period and Control 8 in order to actually add markers. So Control period to preview the audio, Control 8 to add the markers. Okay, so let's get started by previewing the audio. I'm going to select layer 8 and press the period key. Okay, you can press the space bar on your keyboard to stop playback. There is a preference in After Effects in your preferences where you can change the length of the audio preview if you need a longer one. All right, now this time I want to press the period key since we have some familiarity with the music. We can start adding some markers in real time using the asterisk key. Now, don't panic if it doesn't happen the first time, just let the playhead roll back and add more markers. As long as layer 8 is selected, your markers will appear on layer 8. All right, let's get going. And then press the space bar when you're finished. Now, whether or not I have rhythm remains to be seen, but let's count the number of markers. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now that worked out beautifully, but let's open up layer 8 and open up the audio options and open up the waveform. See, this way we can scrub through the timeline and actually look to see if our markers are lining up to the beat. See, the waveform, the larger the area here, the louder the music is. So typically when you're trying to nail something on the beat, you'll want to go with the marker that's closer to the larger point. Now, I'm noticing with these two markers, I was probably trying to hit the same beat. So I'm going to slide this left marker just by clicking right on the edge and dragging it over to the edge right here to just this area. Now, as you're clicking and dragging with your current time indicator, if you hold the Shift key, it will snap to the different markers. So that way you can use the red line to actually make sure that you lined up with the beat. So there we go, and then here. Okay, perfect. Now let's press the period key one more time, and you'll notice the current time indicator scrubbing through, and we can just watch visually to see if things lined up. So I'm going to stop playback and just move this one ahead a little bit so these kind of appear right after each other. Now, there's one last thing with markers in terms of timing to audio. If you double-click on a marker, you can actually open up labels. So here I can type a message or any kind of comment or anything like that. There's obviously all kinds of information you can add to markers. You can even add duration. But I just want to type first so I know this is the first element that's going to appear in the scene. When I click OK, now you can see that appear in the timeline. So obviously it pays to have a short label if you have a bunch of markers that are right next to each other. So once you have your markers in your scene, you're actually ready to start timing animation to the markers. And we're going to jump into that in the next video. Now, in this video, we're going to time the appearance of our graphics to the beat of some audio. And if you look at layer 8, you can see we've already added some markers to the audio. We did that in the previous video. Now, to start trimming and sliding our layers, let's look at how many elements we have that we need to animate. So we have 6 and a background layer. So we have 6 markers here. So let's go ahead and just move the start of all these layers to the start of the different markers. In order to do that, I'm going to click and drag in this number area of my timeline. As I drag, my current time indicator is going to move. And then if I hold Shift, it will snap to each one of these markers. So let's start at the first marker. We're going to select 1 through 6. This is our background layer, so we don't need to change the animation for that. All right. To slide layers back in the timeline, you want to use the bracket key. So if you look at the P key on your keyboard, the key just to the right of that is the left bracket key. So think of that as like a frame. It's holding in the left side of that layer. So when you press it, notice now the left side of the layer has moved to that specific current time indicator. All right, now we'll click and drag and hold down Shift so our current time indicator snaps to the start of the next layer. This time we will hold down Command on the Mac or Control on the PC and just deselect layer 1. And we can left bracket again to trim the start point of layer 2. And let's just repeat this series of commands as we move down the timeline. I'm holding Shift as I drag. I'm holding Command or Control on the PC as I deselect a layer. And then I'm just pressing left bracket to trim the start point of the following layer. We'll just keep repeating this really quickly. And then I will jump back in with some more thoughts. Okay, now if we press the Home key, we can move our current time indicator to the start of our comp and press 0 to load up a RAM preview. Okay, so as you can see, it gets really busy as the different elements are popping into the scene. So what we need to focus on now is actually retiming some of the elements by sliding them in the timeline and then trimming the out points of the layers so these elements don't all pile on top of each other. So to get started, let's look at the beginning of our animation, which is terribly empty. So we can start with this 3D text layer. Just select layer 2. And press the left bracket key to slide it to the front. Now to preview, rather than using RAM, I'm just going to click and drag with my current time indicator. This works well because the word wind pops up and then energy pops in right after that. So that's great. Now, when wind animates away, I want energy to disappear. So I'm going to move my current time indicator just a little bit past the end of our 3D layer here. Select layer 1 and press Option right bracket. When you hold down the Option key, that tells After Effects that you're going to trim that layer rather than slide that layer. So it's Option on the Mac, Alt on Windows. Now, if we move down the timeline, notice we have our logo pop in. Well, that's kind of cool, but I want the logo to reveal last. So let's move down the timeline and let's have our logo actually appear somewhere around 320. I don't want it to be right here at the end just because that's just before the end of our animation. Now we can select layer 3 and just press the left bracket and we've slid that layer down. Let's go to about 3 seconds. I'm choosing that number because when I select layer 4, I want my out point to be there. So let's select layer 4 and just press Option, right bracket to trim the out point. Now, I want this next layer to pop in shortly thereafter, so I'm going to left bracket to slide that layer forwards. And then when we get to this next marker, I want this green layer to disappear. So as I dragged in the timeline, I held Shift, so my current time indicator would snap to the marker. And now we can press Option, right bracket to trim. Okay, now there's one last layer we need to have appear, and it's layer 6. So let's select layer 6 and press the left bracket to slide it. And you guessed it, we'll move down the timeline and Option, right bracket to trim its out point. Now, if we press the home key, we can go ahead and press 0 and preview our animation. So as you can see, we have definitely created more interest in our animation just by trimming and sliding the layers. Now, if I were going to keep continuing to push this animation, I'd focus on adding some effects to that background layer so we could pop our text off of the background. And we'll focus on doing some of that in the next chapter. Now, oftentimes I'll find myself in a situation where I'll need to start building an animation, but I don't have the final elements to actually start the animation. So that may seem like a big issue, but honestly, as long as you have a general idea as to the size of the elements you're going to be working with, you can go ahead and start animating with the elements that you currently have. So to give you an example, let's look at a RAM preview of our project right now. I'm just going to go over to my preview panel and load this up in a RAM preview. Now, as you can see, I have this kind of funky animation built with these shapes that sort of fly through the scene. Now, I wasn't sure whether these would be the final shapes or not, but I went ahead and started building the animation. Now, I'm going to stop playback here for a second. Just in case I have to come back and actually use this version, I'm going to create a different version while still keeping this original version built. So in order to do that, I'm going to select my multi-moves composition and go up under Edit and choose Duplicate. Now, multi-moves 2 will give me my duplicate that we can alter. So let's double-click on multi-moves 2 and look at what we have. Well, we have a pre-composition named Move. So if I double-click that comp, you notice, well, I only have one version of Move. So I need to create a duplicate version of Move if I'm going to change the other composition. So let's select Move and go up under Edit and choose Duplicate. Now, if you double-click Shape 2 in the project panel, look in the layer viewer and you can see we have this circular shape. Now, the new shape we want to replace this with is going to be a square. So let's import that into our project. Double-click on the project panel and navigate in your exercise folder to your footage folder, and in there under Illustrator we want to choose Shape 3. Now we can set this to import as footage, making sure not to select this sequence option. Okay, now when we click Open, we have Shape 3. If you double click to view it, you can see now this is the square. So let's double click and open Move 2. Now within Move 2, select every single layer that's labeled Shape 2. So I'm going to click Layer 1 and hold Shift and click on Layer 4 so they're all selected. To change this shape out, you need to hold the Option key on a Mac or Alt on Windows, and then choose the other shape that you want to use. So I'm going to choose Shape 3, and while I'm holding Option, I'm going to drag it down to the timeline. When we let go with our mouse, notice Shape 3 is now in place, and since it was roughly the same size as Shape 2, if we scrub through the timeline here, you can notice I'm getting the exact same animation. That's great. Now, if we open up Multi-Moves 2, you can see I haven't changed out that element in this version yet. We need to actually swap out the move composition. So select Layer 2, hold down Shift, and select Layer 4. Now layers 2, 3, and 4 are selected, and we can hold down Option on the Mac, Alt on the PC, and select the Move To comp and drag it down into the timeline. When I let go, now notice that new composition has been updated in this version. So if we scrub through our timeline here, you can see we have our new animation with all the keyframes and the new shape, and we still managed to keep the original animation with the multi-moves comp. Let's double click that and scrub through, and you can see now we have two versions of the same animation with two different graphics by using Option Drag to swap the images.